Section 1. The Anatomy of a Mistake. Let's start simply. The Simpsons has been on television since December 17th, 1989. That is not a typo. 36 years, 788 episodes, somewhere in the neighborhood of 17,000 individual scenes, give or take, each one requiring someone to draw it, color it, check it, approve it, and send it out into the world under the assumption that what audiences received was, more or less, what the production intended. And somewhere inside that number, that enormous, almost incomprehensible volume of output, something started to go wrong. Not catastrophically wrong. Not in a way that ruined anything or made the show unwatchable or caused anyone to throw a remote control across the room in frustration. Just quietly, gently, persistently wrong. Wrong in the way that a house settles over decades, developing small cracks in walls that nobody notices until they stop and look closely. Wrong in the way that a long-running story accumulates details that eventually contradict each other, not because anyone was careless, but because the sheer weight of the story makes perfect consistency nearly impossible to maintain. The Simpsons is the longest-running scripted primetime television show in American history. It holds that record comfortably, with a lead over its nearest competitors that can be measured in decades rather than seasons. And with that kind of longevity comes something that no other animated series has ever had to contend with at the same scale. A catalog of mistakes so vast, so varied, and so thoroughly documented by its audience that studying it starts to feel less like picking apart a cartoon and more like archaeology. Tonight, or this morning, or this afternoon, wherever you happen to be watching from, we are going to go through that catalog together. Slowly, carefully, without rush. This is not a video designed to make you feel alarmed or agitated. Think of it more like a long, comfortable walk through a museum dedicated entirely to the small errors of a show that meant a great deal to a great many people. We will cover mistakes in animation, mistakes in writing, mistakes in continuity that stretch across seasons and episodes like cracks in old plaster, mistakes in geography, in character history, in the physical design of buildings and rooms, and the faces of characters you have known for most of your life. We will cover dead characters who came back without explanation, living characters who were briefly transformed into completely different people before anyone noticed, and at least one instance of a prop changing color, shape, and apparent physical properties across 3 consecutive scenes in the same episode. None of this diminishes the show. If anything, the scale of it is its own kind of testament. You cannot accumulate this many mistakes without first producing an almost incomprehensible amount of content. Every error in this video exists because someone was working, creating, building something. The mistakes are the shadow cast by the work. So settle in. Get comfortable. Let this wash over you at whatever pace feels right. Before we get into the categories, it helps to understand what we actually mean when we talk about a Simpsons mistake. Because not all errors are created equal, and part of what makes cataloging them so interesting is that they fall into genuinely distinct types, each one produced by a different failure point in the production pipeline. The first category is the pure animation error. These are the simplest to identify and often the most visually striking. Someone's shirt is the wrong color. A character's hair disappears for a single frame. A background character who was standing on the left side of the screen in one shot is inexplicably standing on the right side in the very next cut, having apparently teleported 3 meters without anyone remarking on it. These errors happen because The Simpsons, particularly in its early seasons, was animated overseas at studios in South Korea, where teams of animators were working from detailed model sheets and storyboards sent from the American production office. The communication chain was long, the turnaround was fast, and occasionally something got lost in transit. A color note didn't make it into the final packet. A character reference sheet was out of date. A background was reused from a different episode without anyone noticing that the window placement didn't match the new scene's layout. The second category is the continuity error. This is where things get more interesting, because continuity errors require a viewer to be paying attention across multiple episodes, sometimes multiple seasons. A continuity error is what happens when the show establishes a fact about a character or a place in one episode and then contradicts that fact in another episode, either accidentally or, as we'll see several times tonight, so aggressively and so completely that it starts to feel almost intentional, as though the show was trying to rewrite itself while everyone was watching. Homer's mother is dead. Homer's mother is alive. Homer was born in 1 year. Homer was born in a different year. The Simpson house has a basement. The Simpson house has no basement and never had one. Springfield is in the north. Springfield is in the south. Ned Flanders moved to Springfield from one city. Ned Flanders moved from a completely different city. These are not subtle variations. These are direct, head-on contradictions, and they accumulate across 36 seasons into something that starts to feel less like a series of individual errors and more like a parallel universe running alongside the one we think we know. The third category is the physics error. The Simpsons is a cartoon, and it does not pretend otherwise. Characters regularly survive things that would kill real people. The laws of gravity are applied selectively. Objects change size depending on what a joke requires. But even within a cartoon's flexible relationship with physics, there are moments where something happens that even the internal logic of the show cannot explain, where a room is too small to contain the furniture in it, or a car travels a distance that the geography of Springfield makes impossible, or a character falls from a height that has been previously established as survivable and then is treated as fatal, without any indication that the rules have changed. The fourth category, and the one that produces some of the most quietly haunting material, is the character history error. This is what happens when the show gives a character a backstory, builds on it over several episodes, and then contradicts it so thoroughly that the character's entire history becomes unstable. We will spend a great deal of time in this category tonight, because it is where some of the show's most interesting and most baffling mistakes lie. And then there is the fifth category, which barely qualifies as a mistake in the traditional sense, but which is worth naming anyway: the retcon. A retcon is when a show deliberately changes an established fact, not by accident, but by choice, because the writers decided they wanted the story to go somewhere that the old version of that fact wouldn't allow. The Simpsons has retconned several significant details about its characters over its run. Some of these retcons are smooth, handled gracefully, and barely noticeable unless you are looking for them. Others are executed with the subtlety of someone driving a freight train through a gift shop, and those are the ones we will linger over with some fondness. The reason people love cataloging Simpsons errors, the reason this kind of video exists, the reason fan wikis have devoted thousands of pages to tracking them, is not because they make the show look bad. It's almost the opposite. There is something deeply comforting about errors in a beloved thing. They are evidence of humanity. They are proof that what you were watching was made by people. Real people with deadlines and coffee on their desks, and disagreements about what color a secondary character's jacket should be. The mistakes make the show feel close. They close the distance between the audience and the screen in a way that a flawless production never quite manages. And The Simpsons, for all its achievements and all its records and all its cultural weight, has always been at its best when it feels close. When it feels like something that was made for you specifically, in the particular way that comedy has of reaching across a room and finding the exact place where you live. So that is what we are doing tonight. We are finding the places where the seams show, where the paint chipped, where the background did not quite match the foreground, and nobody caught it before the episode aired, and then millions of people watched it anyway and loved it anyway and remember it anyway. We are going to find the mistakes, and we are going to enjoy every single one of them. Let's start at the very beginning, with one of the earliest and most thoroughly documented errors in the show's entire run, and work our way forward through the decades. The pilot episode of The Simpsons, technically the first regular episode, since Simpsons Roasting on an Open Fire aired on December 17th, 1989, does not waste any time before introducing its first mistake. The episode concerns Homer's Christmas bonus, or rather his lack of one, and his subsequent decision to enter Santa's Little Helper in a greyhound race. It is a genuinely warm, surprisingly moving piece of television for something that was, in many ways, a rough first draft of a show that would take another season and a half to fully find itself. But watch it carefully, and you will notice something in the opening sequence. The couch. Not the famous couch gag, which had not yet become the elaborate running set piece. It would later be just the ordinary couch in the Simpson living room. In this episode, it is brown, or rather, a sort of orange tan that reads as brown in the context of the room. In subsequent episodes, that same couch is a different shade. And across the first season, the couch cycles through several distinct colors, as though the animation team was still deciding what color it ought to be, and nobody had sent a definitive note. This sounds trivial. It is trivial, and yet it is also the first evidence of something that will persist across the show's entire run. The colors in Springfield are not fixed. They shift and drift and occasionally transform entirely, and the show's enormous production pipeline stretching from writers in Los Angeles to animators in Seoul to editors and post-production teams and standards and practices, departments and network executives does not always catch these shifts before they make it to air. The couch, incidentally, eventually settles into the familiar yellow-green shade that most viewers associate with the Simpson living room. But the journey it takes to get there, documented frame by frame in fan archives, is its own small narrative, a prop gradually becoming itself across the course of a television season. Now, before we go further into the depths of what we are covering tonight, drop a comment below and tell me where you are watching from and what time it is where you are. I want to know if you are watching this at 2 in the morning from somewhere cold or in the middle of a sunny afternoon with nowhere to be. And if you have not subscribed yet, take a moment to do that now, because we have a long way still to go and it is much nicer to walk the distance with a familiar companion. The question of what counts as the show's most significant early error is one that fans have debated for decades, and there are a few strong candidates. But the one that keeps coming up in serious conversations about the show's production history, the one that reveals the most about how the show was made during its formative period, is the matter of Bart Simpson's bedroom. In the first season, Bart's bedroom is shown several times. It is upstairs, which is consistent with the house layout that the show establishes early and more or less maintains throughout its run. The room has a bed, a window, a small desk, and a collection of objects that speak to the personality of a 10-year-old boy with too much energy and not enough supervision. The walls are a specific color. The layout is a specific configuration. In Season 2, Bart's bedroom is different. Not dramatically different. This is not the kind of change that would stop a casual viewer mid-scene. But the dimensions of the room have shifted. The window is in a different position. The desk has moved. The configuration of furniture no longer matches what was established in Season 1. And then in Season 3, the bedroom is different again. The show never addresses this. Bart never says, "I rearranged my room." Marge never mentions having the furniture moved. The bedroom simply becomes a different bedroom over the course of a few seasons, quietly and without ceremony, in the way that places in dreams shift when you are not looking directly at them. This pattern of a space gradually transforming without acknowledgement is one of the most persistent types of error in The Simpsons, and we will return to it in much greater detail in the section dedicated to Springfield's impossible architecture. For now, just know that it begins early. It begins with Bart's room, and it never entirely stops. What makes The Simpsons animation error situation particularly interesting from a production standpoint is the gap between when episodes were written and when they aired. In the early seasons, this gap could be as long as a year. A script would be written, approved, and sent to the overseas animation studio, where it would take months to produce. By the time the finished episode came back to the American production team for final review, several other episodes had already been written, approved, and sent out. The show was essentially running multiple tracks simultaneously, with writers working on Season 3 storylines while Season 2 animation was still coming in for review. This matters because it means that when a mistake was caught in one episode, there was often no time to go back and fix the earlier episode where that mistake first appeared. The correction would come in future episodes, but the error was already in the can, already on its way to the broadcast antenna, and the audience, watching at home on a Thursday or Sunday night, would absorb the mistake alongside everything else: the jokes, the warmth, the moment of genuine emotion in the third act, and most of them would never notice it at all. The ones who did notice were a small and devoted minority in the early years. Before the internet, before DVD releases with pause functionality, before fan wikis and frame-by-frame analysis, Simpsons errors had to be caught in real time, during the broadcast itself, by people who happened to be paying close enough attention. And while some of those people did write letters to Fox, and some of those letters presumably reached the production office, the feedback loop was slow and imperfect. The internet changed this permanently and irreversibly. When episodes began circulating on VHS, and later when DVD releases put high-quality, pausable copies of every episode into the hands of the viewing public, the rate at which Simpsons errors were discovered accelerated dramatically. Fans who had been watching the show for years suddenly had the tools to confirm suspicions they had been carrying since their first viewing. Scene-by-scene analysis became possible. Frame-by-frame analysis became possible. Online forums gave these analysts a place to share their findings, build on each other's work, and accumulate a catalog of errors that no individual fan could have assembled alone. This is why the definitive record of Simpsons mistakes did not exist during the show's golden age. It was assembled over decades by thousands of people working independently and collaboratively across the internet, building something that the show's own creators never anticipated and cannot fully account for. And what they built is what we are working from tonight. There is one more thing worth establishing before we move from this introductory section into the specific categories of error: the question of intention. Some of what gets labeled as a mistake in The Simpsons is actually a deliberate joke. The show has a long and well-documented history of doing something impossible or contradictory on screen for comic effect, fully aware that what it is showing does not match the established rules of its universe. These are not mistakes. These are gags. A character producing an object from a pocket that is far too small to contain it is a joke, not an animation error. Springfield's geography being different in every episode is, at least in part, a running joke that the writers have cultivated deliberately. Separating these intentional inconsistencies from genuine errors is not always straightforward. The honest answer is that sometimes it is impossible to know with certainty whether something was a mistake or a choice, because the person who could tell you definitively has moved on to other projects and the episode aired 30 years ago. In those cases, we will note the ambiguity and move on, because certainty is not what we are after tonight. We are after the experience of looking closely at something familiar and seeing it slightly differently than you saw it before. That is a pleasant experience. It tends to lead to sleep, eventually. Let us continue. Number Section 2. The changing face of Springfield. If you took every face in Springfield and laid them out in order, season by season, from the earliest episodes to the most recent, you would see something that is part natural artistic evolution and part cascade of errors so well documented that the show's own crew has acknowledged them in interviews. Faces in The Simpsons change. They change constantly, and they change in ways that range from barely noticeable to genuinely startling. Let's start with the most obvious example, because it is the one that no serious discussion of Simpsons character design inconsistencies can avoid. Homer Simpson's face in Season 1 versus Homer Simpson's face in, say, Season 8. In the first season, Homer is drawn with a distinctly rounder head. His eyes are slightly different in shape. The proportions of his face are softer, less angular. He looks, if we are being honest about it, less like the Homer Simpson that most people carry in their memory, and more like a slightly cruder preliminary sketch of that character. The version that exists before an artist has fully committed to the final design. By the time the show reached its so-called golden age, somewhere around seasons 3 through 8, Homer's design had solidified into the version that most people recognize. The lines are cleaner. The proportions are more consistent. The animation quality is, in general, higher, more fluid, more expressive, more detailed in its background elements. But here is what makes this interesting from an error cataloging perspective. The transition between these two versions of Homer's face is not clean. It happens gradually over the course of 2 seasons, and during that transition period you can find individual episodes where Homer looks markedly different from one scene to the next. Not because the character was intended to look different, but because different animation teams, working in different facilities, using slightly different reference materials, produced slightly different versions of the same character. There are episodes in the first 2 seasons where Homer's nose changes length between scenes in the same act, where his eyes are a different size in the kitchen than they are in the living room, where the distance between his nose and his upper lip, which is one of the character's most distinctive design elements, shifts noticeably between cuts. These are not dramatic transformations. You have to be looking for them to catch most of them. But once you know they are there, once your eye is calibrated to the subtle variations in the character's design, you start to see them everywhere in those early episodes. It is a bit like the experience of learning to hear a specific instrument in a piece of music. Once you know to listen for it, it becomes hard to unhear. Marge Simpson's face has its own evolution, and it is in some ways more interesting than Homer's because Marge's most distinctive feature, her hair, creates a specific set of animation challenges that produce their own category of error. The hair is tall, famously tall. It towers above her head in a single vertical column that defies the laws of physics in ways that the show has always been happy to wink at. And because it is so prominent, because it is the first thing the eye goes to when Marge is on screen, any inconsistency in how the hair is drawn becomes immediately visible, in a way that a small variation in Homer's nose geometry might not. In early episodes, Marge's hair is slightly blue-tinted, a detail that the show later mostly abandoned in favor of a purer, more vivid color. The height of the hair varies. The shape of the hair's summit varies. There are episodes where the hair has a slight wave to it, and episodes where it is perfectly vertical, and these variations do not always track with any narrative logic. They are just the result of different animators making slightly different interpretations of the same character. But the face beneath the hair also changes. Marge's eyes have shifted over the seasons. Her expression lines have deepened, and then been pulled back in later seasons as the animation style modernized. In the earliest episodes, Marge has a drawn quality to her features that is distinct from the more polished look she acquires by the mid-90s, and the transition between these two versions of her face is, if anything, less smoothly handled than Homer's. There is a specific episode in the second season, and we will come back to this one in a later section, because it also contains a geography error and a continuity mistake of some magnitude where Marge's hair color visibly shifts between the first act and the third act of the same episode. Not a dramatic shift, not the difference between blue and orange, but a definite, documentable change in the saturation of the blue, the kind of thing that happens when two different animation teams are handling different portions of the same episode and are working from slightly different color references. The fact that this is possible, that two animation teams might work on different parts of the same episode, is one of the structural realities of how The Simpsons was produced, and it explains a significant percentage of the mid-episode inconsistencies that fans have documented. A script would be divided into acts. Acts might be sent to different teams. Different teams might interpret the color notes differently, and when the finished acts were assembled into a final episode, the color might drift slightly from Act 1 to Act 3. This is not unique to The Simpsons. Many animated series produced during the same era had similar production pipelines and similar issues. What makes The Simpsons unusual is simply the volume of material produced and the intensity of fan scrutiny applied to it over the decades. Now, let us talk about Bart. Bart Simpson's face changes less dramatically than Homer's or Marge's over the course of the show's run, in part because Bart's design is simpler, less detailed, less dependent on subtle proportional relationships, and therefore easier to replicate consistently across different animation teams. But less dramatically does not mean not at all, and there are specific categories of Bart-related face and design errors that are worth spending some time with. The first is the matter of Bart's eyes. In most episodes, Bart has round, white eyes with black pupils, the standard Simpsons eye design. But in a handful of episodes across the first few seasons, Bart's eyes are drawn with a slightly different pupil shape, slightly more oval, slightly more elongated, that gives him a distinctly different expression. This is not a plot-relevant change. It is not signaling anything about Bart's emotional state. It is simply a variation in the animation that made it through to the finished episode. The second is the matter of Bart's spiky hair. The spikes are a defining element of the character's design. They give him a feral, slightly aggressive silhouette that communicates a great deal about who he is before he even opens his mouth. But the number of spikes on Bart's head is not always consistent. In most depictions there are 9. In some episodes there are 8. In at least one documented instance there appear to be 10. The variation is small enough that it is invisible to most viewers, but it has been documented by fans who were looking specifically for it. The third category of Bart-related design inconsistency is one that applies to several other characters as well: the matter of the 4 fingers. All Simpsons characters, and indeed most characters in animated series of the same era, have 4 fingers on each hand rather than 5. This is a stylistic convention that goes back to the earliest days of American animation, adopted partly for aesthetic reasons and partly because 4-fingered hands are simpler and faster to animate than 5-fingered hands. The Simpsons maintains this convention throughout its run, but maintaining it consistently is harder than it sounds, particularly in scenes that involve close-up shots of hands or complex hand positions. And in a small number of episodes, characters can be observed with 5 fingers briefly, usually in extreme close-up shots where the animator may not have had a 4-fingered hand reference available, or where the stylistic convention temporarily gave way to a more realistic depiction. These 5-fingered moments are among the most sought-after items in the Simpsons error canon. They are rare, they are brief, and they are always accidental. The show has never made any narrative use of the 4 fingers as design choice, unlike some fan theories that have attempted to connect it to the radiation theory we discussed in the transcript material. In terms of actual production history, 5 fingers on a Simpsons character is simply a mistake by an animator whose hand reference may have defaulted to reality rather than to the established style. Lisa Simpson's design is in many ways the most stable of the main families. Her round face, her distinctive red dress, her pointed hair spikes, these elements are clearly defined and relatively easy to reproduce consistently. But Lisa is not without her own category of design errors. The most persistent is the matter of Lisa's necklace. In some episodes, Lisa wears a simple necklace that appears to be a small string of pearls or beads, similar to Marge's famous pearl necklace. In other episodes, the necklace is not present at all. This is not necessarily an error in isolation, it may simply be a detail that some animators included and others did not, based on whether their reference materials included it. But when you compare episodes from the same season and notice that Lisa is wearing the necklace in Act 1 and not wearing it in Act 3 of the same episode, it stops being a matter of styling choices and starts being a matter of someone's reference packet being incomplete. Maggie Simpson, being the character with the fewest design elements and the least complex on-screen requirements, she is, after all, an infant who mostly sucks on a pacifier and makes eyes at the camera, has fewer design errors than her siblings. But she is not immune. In several early episodes, Maggie's bow is drawn in slightly different positions relative to her head. In a small number of episodes, the bow changes color between scenes. These are minor, fleeting things, easily missed, but they are there. And then there is the matter of Springfield's secondary and background characters, who have their own rich and complicated history of design inconsistencies that could, and in some fan communities, has fill entire books. Principal Skinner is one of the best examples. Skinner's character design is deceptively complex for a secondary character. He has specific facial features, the slight downturn of his mouth, the military-precise haircut, the posture that speaks of a man who has been managing small disappointments for his entire adult life that need to be replicated with some care to feel right. And in the early seasons, they are not always replicated with that care. In the first few episodes where Skinner appears, there is a noticeable variation in his height relative to other characters. He appears tall in some shots and significantly shorter in others. His face is softer in some episodes and more angular in others. The distinctive gray suit that eventually becomes the character's defining garment is not always the same shade of gray, a fact that might be attributable to lighting but which occurs too consistently in too many episodes to be entirely explained that way. Skinner is also involved in one of the more charming character design errors in the show's first few seasons. A scene where he is drawn without his glasses in a close-up shot, only for the glasses to reappear in the very next shot without him having done anything to retrieve them. The glasses simply vanish and return, ghost-like, as though they are operating on their own schedule. Chief Wiggum is another secondary character whose design has a complicated early seasons history. In his first appearances, Wiggum is drawn somewhat differently than the version of the character that audiences eventually settled into. He is slightly leaner, his features are slightly sharper, and the characteristic dimness that became such a key part of the character's comedic identity is not yet fully visible in the physical design. Over the first 2 seasons, Wiggum's design softens and rounds in a way that parallels Homer's, and the transition is not entirely smooth. Dr. Nick, the recurring background character whose cheerful medical incompetence has made him one of the show's most beloved minor presences, has one of the most interesting design evolution stories among secondary characters. Dr. Nick's design changes significantly between his first appearance and his more regular appearances later in the show. And the change is not subtle. His face, his skin tone, his proportions, and his overall visual personality are all noticeably different. This would be unremarkable in isolation, but when you see the early version and the later version side by side, it is striking enough that some fans have speculated the production team essentially started over with the character design at some point during the early seasons. The design inconsistencies in Springfield's background populations are, frankly, too numerous to catalog comprehensively. Background characters in The Simpsons are often recycled between episodes, the same crowd models appearing in different contexts, wearing different clothing, sometimes with slightly different colorings. This recycling occasionally produces errors when a specific background character is placed in a scene where their presence makes no contextual sense, or when a character who died in a previous episode appears as a background figure in a crowd scene without comment. But beyond the recycling issue, background characters in The Simpsons are also subject to the most casual treatment in terms of design, consistency, because the production team knew correctly that most viewers would not be examining the background carefully enough to notice. The errors that live in the backgrounds of Springfield scenes are the quiet errors, the ones that only become visible when you are watching the same episode for the fourth or fifth time, looking for something specific. These are some of the most satisfying errors in the entire catalog, because discovering them feels like finding a hidden passage in a house you thought you knew completely. Let us talk about some specific examples. In the episode Bart Gets Famous from Season 5, there is a crowd scene in the first act where a background character appears who is wearing a green shirt. In the next shot of the same crowd, the same character identifiable by their face and the distinctive shape of their silhouette is wearing a blue shirt. The green shirt is simply gone, replaced by blue, with no cutaway or time skip to explain the change. In Homer's triple bypass from Season 4, there is a hospital waiting room scene in which a background character sitting near the door changes from a woman in red clothing to a man in brown clothing between two consecutive shots, despite no one in the scene moving to sit in that chair. In Selma's Choice from Season 4, a background character at Duff Gardens is shown standing in line with both arms at their sides in one shot, and in the very next shot is shown holding a balloon in their right hand that was not present a moment before. The balloon is then present for the rest of the scene, suggesting that the character did, at some point between those two shots, acquire a balloon. But the acquisition happens off-camera and in zero time, which gives it a slightly uncanny quality. These are not devastating failures of production. They are small, gentle errors in the backgrounds of scenes, visible only to the attentive and the unhurried. But collected together, they paint a picture of a production operating at tremendous scale and speed, drawing a world so detailed and so populated that no quality control process could ever catch everything. And that world, errors and all, is one of the most fully realized fictional environments in the history of popular culture. The mistakes are not the opposite of that achievement. They are part of it. Number. Section 3. The impossible architecture of Springfield. The house at 742 Evergreen Terrace has been the central location of The Simpsons since the very first episode. It is, by any reasonable measure, one of the most famous fictional residences in the history of American television. More people can describe the layout of that house than can describe the layout of the house they grew up in. And yet the layout of that house is and has always been completely impossible. This is not a matter of the house being slightly implausible, or of certain rooms being slightly too large, or of the floor plan not quite working if you try to draw it to scale. The house at 742 Evergreen Terrace contains spatial contradictions so fundamental that it could not, under any interpretation of Euclidean geometry, exist as a coherent three-dimensional structure. Let us start with the basement. The Simpson house has a basement, or it does not. The answer depends entirely on which episode you are watching. In some episodes, particularly in the later seasons, the basement is a clearly established part of the house's architecture. Characters go down into it. Events happen there. It functions as a normal basement functions a space below the main floor, accessible by stairs, used for storage and the various domestic purposes that basements serve. In other episodes, distributed across multiple seasons, characters who would logically be using the basement if it existed instead do the equivalent thing in a different location, without any indication that a basement is available to them. More damning, there are episodes where a character is seen in a location directly below the main floor of the house which should be in the basement, if the basement exists but the scene makes clear that they are actually at ground level, with the outdoors visible through windows that could not logically exist in an underground room. The basement of the Simpson house is neither there nor not there. It occupies a kind of quantum architectural state, available when the story requires it and absent when the story does not. The garage has a similar problem. The Simpson house has a garage. In some episodes, the garage contains Homer's car, a lawnmower, and the accumulated debris of a suburban family's life over several years. In other episodes, the same garage contains a completely different collection of objects with no indication of what happened to the previous contents. In still other episodes, the garage serves as a workspace or hobby space that is organized and equipped in ways that are inconsistent with its depiction in other episodes. And then there are the episodes where the garage appears not to connect to the house at all, where a character exits through the front door, walks outside, and enters the garage as a separate structure, when previous episodes have established a direct interior connection between the two. The attic. The attic of the Simpson house is established in several episodes as an accessible space with a pull-down ladder containing boxes of old family items and the kind of sentimental storage that attics accumulate over generations. It is the source of several episode premises across the show's run: Homer or Bart climbing up into the attic and finding something significant among the stored family artifacts. In other episodes, characters attempting to access any part of the house above the main floor to retrieve something from storage, or to access a roof hatch, or to investigate a noise do not use the attic access, and do not appear to be aware that an attic exists. The space above the second floor of the Simpson house is, like the basement below it, both definitely there and definitely not there depending on which episode you are in. The floor plan of the main living area changes between episodes in ways that are too consistent to be explained by simple animation error. The relationship between the kitchen and the living room shifts. The stairs are positioned differently in different episodes. The front door, which is used in essentially every episode and which you might think would be one of the most reliably consistent elements of the house's design, is in a different position relative to the staircase in different episodes. In some, you can see both the door and the stairs in the same frame, and their relationship to each other is one thing. In others, they appear to be in entirely different positions, with the spatial relationship between them reversed. The second floor is where things become genuinely destabilizing. In most episodes, the Simpson house appears to have a relatively compact second floor, with a hallway serving the family's bedrooms. The bedrooms open off this hallway. The bathroom is up there. The layout, while never precisely delineated, feels like the second floor of a relatively modest suburban house. But in some episodes, the second floor of the Simpson house appears to be significantly larger than the house's exterior would suggest possible. Rooms appear that have no place in the architectural footprint of the building as seen from outside. Hallways extend for longer than they should be able to extend. The bathroom, which in most episodes is a single room with a consistent set of fixtures, occasionally appears to have additional features: a window in a different position, an extra door, a shelf or cabinet that was not present in previous episodes. The most famous specific example of the Simpson house's spatial impossibility is the matter of Homer and Marge's bedroom window. The window in the parents' bedroom faces in a direction that, given the established position of the house on Evergreen Terrace and the established position of the Flanders house next door, should provide a view of either the neighboring yard or the side of the house. But in multiple episodes, the view from that bedroom window is something entirely different: the street, or a portion of the yard that could not logically be visible from that position, or, in at least one documented instance, a view that appears to show the back of the house, which would require the window to be looking through other rooms. This is a small thing. It is the kind of thing that you would never notice unless someone pointed it out, and even then you might not be fully convinced. But when you look at it in conjunction with all the other spatial impossibilities of 742 Evergreen Terrace, it becomes part of a larger picture. The Simpson house is not a house. It is a collection of domestic spaces that have the feel and emotional resonance of a house, assembled for narrative convenience rather than architectural logic, and it shifts and reconfigures itself between episodes in the way that houses in dreams shift and reconfigure themselves, maintaining the essential identity of the place while being entirely unwilling to commit to a fixed geometry. Springfield Elementary School is the second most documented location in terms of spatial inconsistency, and it presents an even more ambitious set of architectural paradoxes than the Simpson home. The exterior of Springfield Elementary has a specific, recognizable design. The building is a certain shape and size. It has a certain number of floors. The entrance is in a certain position. These elements, while not always perfectly consistent across 36 seasons, are stable enough that the building is identifiable across the vast majority of its appearances. The interior, on the other hand, seems to be a different institution entirely. Principal Skinner's office is a reliable example. The office appears in dozens of episodes across the show's run, and its layout is sufficiently varied across those appearances that it seems unlikely to be the same room. The desk changes position. The window is on different walls in different episodes. The door leading to the outer office where Mrs. Krabappel or another administrative staff member typically sits is sometimes on the left side of the room and sometimes on the right. The dimensions of the room are noticeably different in some episodes compared to others. The cafeteria is a space that is central to several of the show's most memorable school set episodes, and it has one of the more striking architectural errors in the building's interior. In several episodes, The cafeteria is shown with windows that look out onto a specific portion of the school grounds. But based on the position of those windows relative to other established reference points in the building's interior, the hallway leading to it, the location of the kitchen, the placement of the entrance, the exterior position of those windows would be inside the building, looking through a wall that should not have an exterior face. This is the kind of architectural error that is only visible if you are trying to mentally construct a coherent floor plan of the building, which the show never intended for you to do. The cafeteria was designed to feel like a cafeteria. The principal's office was designed to feel like a principal's office. They were not designed to exist as part of a coherent building that you could map. And yet, because the show has been running for 36 years and has returned to these locations hundreds of times, enough detail has accumulated that the attempt to construct a coherent floor plan has been made by fans, by architecture students who chose The Simpsons as a subject for academic exercises, by at least one professional who documented the attempt in some detail. And what those attempts reveal, without exception, is a building that cannot exist in three-dimensional space as a unified structure. Moe's Tavern has a different kind of spatial problem. The tavern is a relatively simple space, a long bar, some stools, a few tables, a phone on the bar, a back room that is referenced occasionally. This simplicity means that spatial inconsistencies are actually more noticeable because there is less complexity to hide them behind. The most persistent Moe's Tavern spatial error involves the back room. In some episodes, the back room of the tavern is clearly a small, limited space, a break room or storage area of the kind found in similar establishments. In other episodes, the back room contains spaces and facilities that could not logistically fit into the footprint of the building. Given the established dimensions of the main bar area and the exterior shots of the building's size and position on the street, there is also the matter of the tavern's front window, which faces out onto the street. In most episodes, this window provides a view of an ordinary Springfield street scene. But the street visible through this window changes between episodes in ways that suggest the window is not looking out onto any fixed location. Sometimes the view suggests a busy commercial district. Sometimes it suggests a quieter, more residential area. In at least 2 episodes, the weather conditions visible through the window do not match the weather established by scenes set outdoors in the same episode. The nuclear power plant deserves its own extended treatment, and it will receive one later in this video when we get to Homer's workplace errors. For now, it is enough to note that the plant's interior has the most extensive and most thoroughly documented catalog of spatial inconsistencies of any location in Springfield, a distinction it earns partly because it is a large and complex space with many different functional areas, and partly because the writers and animators return to it so frequently across 36 seasons that the accumulated variations in its layout became staggering. There is, across all of Springfield's architecture, a quality that might be called dreamlike, if you are feeling charitable, or inconsistently realized, if you are not. The buildings and spaces of this town were designed to serve stories rather than to be geographically coherent. They expand when the story needs them to be larger. They contract when a scene requires characters to be close together in a confined space. They grow new rooms when a plot needs a room. They lose rooms when the memory of them would be inconvenient. This is perfectly reasonable for a cartoon. It is the kind of freedom that distinguishes animation from live action, where a set is built once and then you are committed to its dimensions for the duration of the production. Animation sets can be whatever the story needs them to be in any given moment. The problem, or the delight, depending on how you approach it, is that The Simpsons has been doing this for 36 years, and the accumulated record of all those individually reasonable decisions has produced a Springfield that is architecturally insane by any standard of measurement you care to apply. One additional spatial category worth touching on before we move to the timeline section: the matter of Springfield's civic buildings and public spaces, which have their own long history of inconsistency. The Springfield Town Hall appears in numerous episodes, and its design changes between appearances in ways that suggest either a remarkable series of renovations or an architectural situation similar to the Simpson house, a building that is defined more by the feeling it evokes than by any fixed physical reality. The entrance changes. The interior layout changes. The position of the mayor's office relative to the public spaces of the building shifts between episodes. The Springfield Police Department has a similar history. In some episodes, the police headquarters is a significant civic building with multiple floors and a proper holding area. In others, it has the dimensions and apparent resources of a very small rural police station. The cells have different configurations in different episodes. The entrance changes, the view from the windows changes. These variations in civic architecture are perhaps less surprising than the variations in domestic architecture, because civic buildings change in the real world too. They are renovated, expanded, remodeled, but the scale of change visible across the show's episodes, and the fact that it is never acknowledged within the show's narrative, gives it the same quality as the Simpson house. A space that is true to itself without being committed to any specific physical reality. Springfield is not a town you can walk around in. It is a town you can live in, through the television screen, and that is an entirely different thing. Number. Section 4. The timeline that ate itself. The Simpsons has a timeline problem. Not one timeline problem, many timeline problems. Accumulated across 36 seasons of trying to tell new stories about characters whose history keeps needing to be rewritten to accommodate the floating present of the show's narrative. We touched on this briefly in the introduction, and the concept of the floating timeline, the idea that the show's present is always the viewer's present, while the characters never age, is well established in public discourse about the show. But what is less well documented is the specific catalog of contradictions that this floating timeline has produced. The precise ways in which the show's history has been rewritten, the individual episodes where a new backstory directly contradicts an old one, and the moments where the accumulation of these contradictions becomes so dense that the characters' histories dissolve into a kind of rich, comfortable incoherence. Let us begin with Homer's date of birth. Homer Simpson was born on May 12th. This much is established clearly enough in enough episodes that it can be treated as settled, but the year of his birth is another matter entirely. In I Married Marge, a flashback episode from Season 3 that depicts Homer and Marge's early relationship, the timeline of events places Homer's youth in the 1970s. The flashback includes cultural references, fashion choices, and technological context that are consistent with the late 70s and early 80s. Based on this timeline, Homer would have been born sometime around 1956 or 1957. In The Way We Was, another flashback episode that depicts Homer and Marge's high school courtship, the timeline places their teenage years in 1974. If Homer was a teenager in 1974, he was born around 1957 or 1958. This is consistent with the previous flashback. In That 90s Sash Show, a significantly later episode that sparked considerable controversy among fans for its aggressive rewriting of the show's established timeline, Homer and Marge's early relationship is depicted as having taken place in the 1990s, specifically in what appears to be approximately 1993 or 1994. If Homer was in his early 20s in 1993, he would have been born around 1971. These two dates, approximately 1957 and approximately 1971, differ by 14 years. This is not a small discrepancy. This is not a matter of rounding. This is the difference between Homer being Marge's contemporary and Homer being a member of a significantly younger generation. The episode That 90s Show is one of the most discussed timeline error episodes in the show's history, precisely because it does not just introduce a small inconsistency, but actively dismantles an established narrative in order to make its premise work. The episode requires Homer and Marge to have been young adults in the 90s, and so it simply makes them young adults in the 90s, regardless of what earlier episodes had established about when they were young. The backlash to this episode was substantial. Fans who had spent years engaging with the show's established history found the wholesale revision jarring. The writers were aware of the criticism, but the episode aired as produced, and its version of events now exists in the record alongside all the earlier, contradictory versions. Homer's origin story, the specific narrative of how he grew up, how he met Marge, and what his life looked like before the events of the show has been told in at least 4 significantly different versions across the show's run. Each version is internally consistent. Each version is emotionally resonant and well-produced. And each version contradicts at least one of the others in ways that cannot be reconciled. This is not, to be clear, a unique problem for The Simpsons. Long-running serialized storytelling in any medium tends to produce origin story drift over time, as new creative teams put their own stamp on the material, and as the passage of real-world time forces changes to what counts as plausible backstory. But The Simpsons has produced so many versions of its characters' origins across so many episodes that the drift has become its own kind of monument. Marge's history is similarly fractured. In some episodes, Marge's youth is depicted as having taken place in a conservative household, where she was raised to be proper, restrained, and rule following a childhood that directly shaped the person she became as an adult. In other episodes, Marge's teenage and young adult years are depicted in ways that are significantly less conservative and more adventurous, including depictions of Marge having genuine rebellious inclinations that sit uncomfortably with the characterization of her childhood in other episodes. The matter of Marge's hair is particularly interesting in the context of timeline errors. The hair iconic, towering, definitively Marge has been depicted in several different ways in flashback episodes showing her childhood and teenage years. In some flashbacks, young Marge already has her characteristic tall hair in a smaller or more modest version appropriate to her age. In other flashbacks, young Marge has conventional, flat, relatively normal hair, with no indication that the tower is something she developed later in life. These two versions of Marge's hair history produce an interesting question. Is the hair a genetic trait, something she was born with in some fundamental sense? Or is it a style she adopted at some point in her adolescence? The show has never committed to an answer, and the different flashback depictions exist in permanent, gentle contradiction. Bart's birthday is another well-documented timeline error. In the episode Radio Bart from Season 3, Bart's birthday is established as April 1st, April Fool's Day, which fits his character perfectly and has become something of accepted canon in the fan community. In other episodes, Bart's birthday appears to fall on different dates, with some suggesting a winter birthday and others suggesting a summer one. The April Fool's Day date is the most widely accepted because it is the one that was given the most explicit in-episode treatment, but it has never been definitively confirmed as the show's official position. More significantly, Bart's birth year is a moving target in exactly the way that Homer's is, because it too is subject to the floating timeline. If Bart is always 10 years old and the present is always the viewer's present, then Bart was born approximately 10 years before any given episode, which means that as the show has progressed, Bart's birth year has marched steadily forward. A Bart born in 1979 in the context of the first season is a Bart born in 2015 in the context of a current episode. The show has handled this by not handling it. Flashback episodes involving Bart's early childhood are simply set in whatever era makes the story work, with the implicit understanding that nobody is meant to do the math, and that doing the math will produce results that the show has no interest in accounting for. But the math has been done, repeatedly, by fans who found the exercise interesting, and the results are exactly as incoherent as you would expect. A Bart Simpson who was born in as many as 7 different decades, depending on which combination of episodes you use as your source material. The timeline of Lisa's intellectual development is one of the show's most interesting and most internally inconsistent ongoing narratives. Lisa is established early in the show as exceptionally intelligent, a gifted child in a family and community that does not quite know how to accommodate that gift. This is one of the show's most consistent and most emotionally resonant ongoing storylines. But the specific details of Lisa's intellectual development are not always consistent. Her abilities in music, in academic subjects, in critical thinking vary between episodes in ways that suggest different writers having slightly different understandings of what exceptionally intelligent means in practical terms. In some episodes, Lisa's intelligence is portrayed as operating well beyond her grade level in a way that creates real social difficulties for her. In others, she is a smart kid, but not so dramatically smart that she is out of step with her environment in any significant way. These variations are partly a matter of what any given episode requires, and partly the inevitable consequence of a character being written by dozens of different writers across 3 decades. But they accumulate into a portrait of Lisa that is slightly inconsistent, brilliant in some episodes, merely above average in others in a way that prevents her intelligence from being treated as a fixed, clearly defined quantity. The timeline inconsistencies around Maggie are fewer and less dramatic, partly because Maggie has so little narrative to begin with. She is 1 year old. She has been 1 year old for 36 years. The floating timeline applied to Maggie produces the same paradox it produces for her siblings, a child born in 1988 in the context of the first season, and a child born in 2024 in the context of a current episode. But since Maggie's narrative is less elaborate than Bart's or Lisa's, there are fewer flashback episodes to contradict each other. The main Maggie timeline error is simple and consistent. She is always one. The show has imagined her future self in flash-forward episodes, and these depictions are not always consistent with each other. A future Maggie in one episode is quite different from a future Maggie in another, in terms of both appearance and personality. These are, strictly speaking, speculative futures rather than established history, so they carry less weight as continuity errors. But they are worth noting as part of the broader pattern of The Simpsons treating its characters' timelines as fluid material to be shaped by each individual episode's needs. Abe Simpson's timeline is in some ways the most thoroughly problematic of any character on the show. Because Abe is old, he is the character most explicitly connected to historical events, and therefore the floating timeline affects his backstory more dramatically than it affects anyone else's. In the early seasons, Abe's memories and stories are anchored to World War II as a central reference point. He is a veteran. He has stories from his service. The war is a fixed point in his past, a horizon from which everything else in his life can be dated. These early stories establish Abe as a man whose youth was shaped by the 1930s and 40s, whose sense of himself was formed in a specific historical context. As the show progressed and the floating timeline pulled the present further from World War II, Abe's backstory became harder to maintain consistently. By the time the show was in its 20th year, an Abe who was young during World War II would have been, in any realistic accounting, well over 100 years old. The show did not adjust Abe's apparent age to match this, because adjusting his apparent age would mean either making him impossibly old or relocating his formative years to a different historical period. What the show did instead was continue to use World War II references alongside Abe when the joke or story required them, while quietly ignoring the arithmetic that would make those references impossible. This works well enough as a practical storytelling strategy, but it means that Abe Simpson's historical timeline, the map of when things happened in his life, is one of the least coherent in the show's entire cast of characters. The relationship between Abe and Burns is another timeline casualty. Several episodes establish that Abe and Burns have a history together. They served in the same military unit. They have interacted at various points over the decades. They share a past that occasionally becomes plot relevant. But the specific details of this shared history are not consistent across episodes. The nature of their wartime relationship changes. Events that were established in one episode are contradicted by details introduced in a later episode. The timeline of their association is another piece of Springfield history that the show treats as infinitely revisable. One of the most specific and most elegantly documented timeline errors in the entire show involves the matter of when Homer and Marge had their first child. In I Married Marge, the sequence of events is established clearly. Marge becomes pregnant, they get married, Bart is born. The timeline in the episode places this in a specific period, late 70s, early 80s, and the details are presented with enough care and emotional investment that they feel definitive. But in The Way We Was, a flashback episode that covers the earlier period of Homer and Marge's courtship in high school, the timeline creates an arithmetic problem. If Homer and Marge met in 1974, as established in that episode, and if Bart was born in the period suggested by I Married Marge, then the gap between their first meeting and the birth of their first child is longer or shorter than the show's other episodes suggest, depending on which details you use to anchor the calculation. This is not a dramatic error. It is the kind of error that only becomes visible when you attempt to construct a unified timeline from multiple episodes that were written independently by different writers at different points in the show's history. But it is a clear instance of the show's timeline being handled differently by different production teams, and it is representative of a much larger pattern that runs through the show's entire run. The floating timeline is both the cause and the solution to most of the show's timeline problems. It is the cause because it requires the past to keep shifting to maintain the fixed present. It is the solution because it gives the show the freedom to simply not commit to any specific version of the past, to treat all backstories as provisional, to revise them as needed, and to rely on the audience's emotional investment in the characters to smooth over any inconsistencies. This strategy works most of the time. The Simpsons audience has an enormous capacity for tolerating timeline inconsistency, partly because they have been doing it for 36 years, and partly because the character's emotional truth, the way Homer's love for his family feels consistent even when the facts of his history do not, is more compelling than any specific detail of when or where things happened. But the specific inconsistencies, cataloged and compared, are a remarkable record of what it costs to tell a story this long without committing to a fixed past. Number Section 5. The wardrobe department had one job. Clothing errors in The Simpsons are, in some ways, the most purely visual category of mistake in the show's catalog. They do not require contextual knowledge, historical awareness, or careful arithmetic to identify. They require only eyes and the patience to pause a moment on screen and notice that something is different than it was 2 seconds ago. And yet, for all their visual clarity, clothing errors in The Simpsons are not as simple as they first appear. The show has a complex relationship with the clothing its characters wear, one that involves intentional design choices, practical animation conventions, and genuine mistakes all existing simultaneously and sometimes becoming hard to distinguish from one another. The baseline clothing situation in The Simpsons is that the main family members have effectively fixed outfits that they wear in almost every episode. Homer has his white shirt, his gray pants, and his white shoes. Marge has her red dress with the white collar and her red shoes. Bart has his red shirt and blue shorts. Lisa has her red dress with white collar. Maggie has her orange outfit and her bow. These fixed outfits are a practical animation choice. Giving each character a default costume means that animators do not need to design new clothing for each episode, and it means that the characters are always immediately identifiable, regardless of the context in which they appear. The fixed outfit convention is also a storytelling convention. These characters are defined by their clothing in the way that cartoon characters traditionally are, their outfits becoming as much a part of their identity as their faces or their voices. When a character wears something different, when Homer puts on a different shirt for a special occasion, or Marge wears a different dress, or Bart gets a different outfit for an episode-specific reason, it is notable precisely because it departs from the fixed baseline. But the fixed outfits also create a specific category of error. When the fixed outfit changes slightly between scenes, or when a character's clothing is the wrong color for a scene or two in the middle of an episode, the departure is jarring in a way it would not be for a character with a more varied wardrobe. Homer's shirt is white. In a significant number of scenes across the show's run, particularly in the first few seasons, it is not white. It is cream. It is light gray. It is slightly off-white in a way that reads as yellow-tinted in some lighting. The variation is small, and it is the kind of thing that could be explained by differences in screen settings or broadcast quality for much of the show's early history. But on modern high-definition displays, with proper color calibration, the drift in Homer's shirt color is visible and documentable. More striking is the category of error where Homer's shirt color changes significantly, not just from white to cream, but from white to a clearly different color within the same episode. There are documented instances in the first 3 seasons where Homer's shirt is notably different in color between scenes. This is not, in most cases, a deliberate costuming choice. It is an animation error, the result of a scene being handled by a different team than the surrounding scenes, or of a color reference being misread, or of a corrected color note not making it into the final finished product. Marge's outfit has its own color variation history. The red dress, which should be a consistent, specific shade of red, varies significantly across episodes from the first few seasons. In some episodes it reads as a warm orange-red. In others it is a cooler, more magenta-adjacent red. The variation is most noticeable when comparing episodes from early in the show's run to each other. Rather than comparing early episodes to later ones, the color seems to have stabilized at some point in the middle seasons, and later episodes are more consistent. Bart's red shirt has a similar history. The red of Bart's shirt varies between episodes in ways that are subtle but documentable. And in at least one episode from the second season, there is a scene where Bart's shirt appears to be orange rather than red, not a slight variation in shade, but a genuine shift in color that produces a meaningfully different-looking Bart for the duration of the scene. The clothing errors become more interesting and more varied when we look at episodes where characters wear specific, non-standard outfits, formal wear, work clothes, costumes, or clothing specific to a particular scene's setting. The wedding flashback in I Married Marge is a well-documented example. In this episode, characters attending the wedding are shown in period-appropriate clothing that varies in subtle ways between scenes. A tie changes width. A dress shifts slightly in color. These are period piece animation challenges. Getting the details of clothing from a specific historical era right requires more research and more precise reference materials than simply drawing Homer's standard white shirt. And the show does not always execute this perfectly. The category of Bart in costume episodes produces some of the most entertaining clothing errors. When Bart is wearing a costume that involves many specific elements, a specific color combination, specific accessories, specific details, the likelihood of a small error in the costume's depiction increases with the complexity of the costume. And some of the costume elements in these episodes are genuinely complex, with multiple layered pieces that different animators might interpret slightly differently. There is an episode from the 5th season, and this particular error has been documented in enough fan discussions that it can be described with reasonable confidence, where Bart is wearing a costume that includes a specific colored element. Between the first act and the second act of the same episode, that specific colored element changes color, not dramatically, not in a way that would stop a casual viewer, but clearly, definitively, and without any in-story explanation. Ned Flanders' wardrobe provides one of the show's most persistent and most charming clothing errors. Ned is typically depicted wearing a green sweater, one of his most defining visual characteristics, the kind of reliable, comfortable garment that speaks perfectly to his gentle, unhurried character. But the shade of Ned's green sweater is not fixed. It varies between episodes in ways that range from subtle to quite noticeable. The sweater can be a warm yellow-green in some episodes and a cool blue-green in others. There are episodes where the sweater appears almost teal, and episodes where it is clearly a conventional middle-tone green. This might seem trivial. It is trivial, but Ned's green sweater is one of the most recognizable garments in American animated television, and its color instability is a gentle reminder that even the most iconic visual details of a beloved show can be less fixed than we imagine them to be. The matter of shoes is another productive area for clothing errors. Shoes are small, they are at the bottom of the frame, and they are easy for animators to get wrong or simply to leave out to draw a character without shoes in a shot where the feet are visible, when that character should logically be wearing shoes. Homer's white shoes are absent in several documented scenes across the show's run. In some of these scenes, Homer is depicted as barefoot in a context where being barefoot would be unusual or logically inconsistent, a grocery store, or a work setting, or a formal occasion. In others, the shoes appear to simply have been forgotten, with Homer's feet drawn but shoeless in a scene where their absence is not a plot element. Other characters have similar shoe-related inconsistencies. Bart's shoes, he is typically depicted wearing red shoes, have been drawn in other colors in a number of scenes. Marge's shoes have appeared in different heel heights in different episodes, with the variation occasionally noticeable enough within a single episode that it suggests the shoe reference was not consistent across the animation team. The most interesting clothing errors, from a storytelling perspective, are the ones that involve props that are part of an outfit items that a character is meant to be wearing or carrying that appear and disappear between scenes in ways that the narrative does not account for. Homer's tie is the canonical example. Homer wears a tie at work. He does not always wear it at home. This is a sensible and realistic costuming choice. But there are episodes, particularly in the earlier seasons, where Homer's tie status changes between scenes in the same episode without any indication that he has removed or added the tie. He is wearing it in the kitchen, he is not wearing it in the living room. He is wearing it again in the next kitchen scene, in what appears to be narrative continuity with the earlier kitchen scene. The tie appears and disappears without ceremony. This particular error is the kind that is almost certainly produced by scenes being animated separately and then assembled, with different animators having different ideas about which version of Homer tie or no tie was the appropriate one for a given location. The tie as a work accessory seems obvious enough that some animators may have simply assumed a home scene meant no tie, while others looked at the character model and included the tie because it was in the reference. The result is a Homer who, in some episodes, appears to be changing his tie status between scenes with the effortless casualness of a man who has made peace with the arbitrary nature of professional dress codes. Principal Skinner's military dress uniform appears in several episodes, and its specific details, the ribbons and insignia associated with his Vietnam War service, are not always consistent between appearances. This is a genuinely difficult category of costume to get right, because military dress uniforms have specific, meaningful configurations of ribbons and insignia that communicate rank, service history, and honors received. Getting these details right requires precise reference materials. Getting them wrong, placing a ribbon in the wrong position, including an incorrect insignia, getting the color of a specific element wrong is an error that most viewers would not catch, but that the small number of viewers with military knowledge or interest would notice immediately. The specific configuration of Skinner's ribbons changes between some of his formal appearances. The changes are not dramatic. They are not the kind of change that would make his uniform look wrong to a casual eye. But they are documentable, and they represent one of the categories of clothing error that comes from the intersection of a complex, detail-sensitive subject with the practical realities of animation production. Costume episodes where the main characters are wearing Halloween costumes or period costumes for a historical flashback, or theatrical costumes for a school play or community performance are consistently a rich source of clothing errors. The more elaborate the costume, the more opportunities for small inconsistencies to creep in. And The Simpsons has produced enough elaborate costume sequences over 36 seasons that the catalog of costume errors alone could sustain a separate video. The Treehouse of Horror episodes, which feature the most elaborate and varied costume and character design work in the show's history, also feature the highest density of design inconsistencies, partly because the special visual ambitions of these episodes push the animation further than standard episodes, and partly because the non-canonical nature of the Treehouse episodes may have meant slightly less rigorous consistency checking. We will discuss the Treehouse of Horror episodes in more detail later in this video, when we get to the section on how those episodes have occasionally contaminated the show's regular continuity. For now, it is enough to note that if you are looking for clothing errors in The Simpsons, the October episodes are particularly fertile territory. The relationship between clothing errors and the show's international animation pipelines is worth briefly acknowledging here. In the periods when The Simpsons was animated in South Korea, communication about color and design details happened primarily through written notes and reference materials. When a color note was ambiguous or when a reference sheet was out of date, the Korean animation team made their best interpretation and proceeded. Sometimes those interpretations were exactly right. Sometimes they were close, but not quite. And sometimes the result was a shirt that was visibly the wrong color, or a costume element that was in the wrong position, or shoes that had simply vanished. The creative teams at the American production office would review finished animation and catch many of these issues before they made it to air. But some got through enough to fill this section of the video with comfortable and unhurried detail. There is one more clothing category worth noting before we move on. The matter of clothing in scenes that are designed to be surprising, where a character's outfit is part of a visual punchline or reveal. In these scenes, the clothing needs to be exactly right. At the moment of the reveal, wrong details would undermine the joke. And yet these scenes, because they often involve unusual or elaborate costumes or outfits, are also the scenes most likely to produce errors. The show's writers and production team were generally aware of this risk and took extra care with clothing in plot-critical moments. But extra care in the context of a show producing 20-plus episodes a year does not mean perfect. And there are documented instances of reveal outfit errors that survived the review process and made it to air. These are among the most endearing errors in the catalog, precisely because the surrounding scene worked well enough that the error did not break anything. The joke landed, the character moment was effective, and somewhere in the frame, the tie was the wrong color, or the shoes were missing, or the costume had gained or lost an element between shots. And nobody watching at home noticed, in the moment, because they were laughing. Number. Section 6. Dead characters who forgot they were dead. Death in Springfield is not what it is everywhere else. This is partially a function of cartoon physics in an animated world. The rules governing what the human body can survive are considerably more flexible than they are in reality, and even the most dramatic-seeming injury tends to resolve without permanent consequence. But The Simpsons has a more specific relationship with death than most animated series, because it has, on several occasions, killed characters with genuine narrative weight and dramatic intent in ways that were clearly meant to be permanent. And then those characters have come back. Sometimes this is acknowledged within the show's narrative, a dream sequence, a Treehouse of Horror revival, a flashback, but sometimes a character who was explicitly, definitively killed in one episode simply reappears in a later episode, present and functional, without any explanation for their continued existence. This is one of the most uniquely Simpsons categories of error, because it requires a specific combination of factors. A show with the longevity to kill a character and then have enough subsequent seasons that the death becomes inconvenient, A production team large enough that the writer of a later episode might not be fully aware of the earlier death, and an audience dedicated enough to track both the death and the reappearance. Let us start with the most famous case, Maud Flanders. Maud Flanders, Ned's wife and the mother of Rod and Todd, was killed in the season 11 episode Alone Again, Natura d'Italy. The death scene, Maud is struck by t-shirt cannon projectiles while Ned is distracted, and she falls from the bleachers at the Springfield Speedway, was intended to be permanent. The show's creative team at the time had decided to write out the character, and Maud's death served as the catalyst for a multi-season exploration of Ned's grief and eventual recovery. The death was significant enough to generate real fan discussion and some genuine emotion. Maud was a character with history. Her relationship with Ned was part of the show's moral and emotional architecture. Her absence would be felt. And it was felt for a while. Subsequent episodes dealt with Ned's widowhood honestly and with some care. Maud was referenced, mourned, and remembered in ways that suggested the show was treating her death with the seriousness it deserved. But then Maud began to reappear. Not dramatically, not in a way that required anyone to acknowledge that she had died. She appeared in crowd scenes, in the background of episodes set in periods before her death. She appeared in flashback sequences where her presence was entirely appropriate. Some of these appearances are clearly intentional and unproblematic, but there are also documented instances where Maud Flanders appears in crowd scenes or background situations that are set in the show's present after her death without any indication that she is a ghost, a dream, or a flashback. She is simply there, in the background, at a Springfield event, alive and unremarked upon. These appearances are, charitably, production errors, moments where a background character model was placed in a scene without anyone noticing that the character had died several seasons earlier. They are, less charitably, evidence that the show's institutional memory of its own history has limits, and that those limits produce genuine continuity errors. Maud is the most prominent example, but she is far from the only one. Bleeding Gums Murphy, the jazz musician who serves as Lisa's musical mentor in several early episodes, dies in the season 6 episode Round Springfield. His death is treated with considerable narrative weight. It prompts Lisa to buy and rescue his only album, and his ghost appears to her in a cloud formation, in a final scene that is one of the more genuinely moving moments in the show's mid-period. Bleeding Gums Murphy has subsequently appeared in crowd scenes and background settings in later episodes set after his death. Like Maud, these appearances are most likely production errors, background character models placed without awareness of the character's canonical death. But they have been documented by fans, and they represent a pattern. Springfield's dead do not stay quietly off screen. Frank Grimes, or Grimy, as he preferred not to be called, is the subject of one of the most famous single-episode character arcs in the show's history. The Season 8 episode Homer's Enemy introduces Grimes as a hard-working, capable, deeply frustrated man who cannot understand why Homer Simpson, incompetent, lucky, apparently impervious to consequence, occupies the position he does in Springfield's society. Grimes's frustration escalates throughout the episode until he snaps, mimics Homer's reckless behavior, and is electrocuted by exposed wiring. He dies. It is, by design, a dark episode, one of the darkest in the show's history, and one of the most deliberately uncomfortable. Grimes's death is played straight, with real weight, because the episode's point is that a man who operates by the rules of the real world, imported into Springfield's consequence-free environment, cannot survive there. His death is the joke, in the darkest possible sense. Frank Grimes has subsequently appeared in at least 2 episodes after his death. One of these appearances is in a Treehouse of Horror episode, which operates under different rules and does not affect the regular continuity. The other is a background appearance in what appears to be a regular episode, where Grimes is visible in a crowd setting without any acknowledgement of his death or any narrative framing that would explain his continued existence. There is also the matter of Frank Grimes Jr., introduced in a later episode as Grimes's son, who blames Homer for his father's death and attempts revenge. The Grimes Jr. episode acknowledges the original death explicitly and builds on it, which means that at least some continuity with the original episode is maintained. Grimes is dead in the show's official history. The background appearance then is a clearer error, a character who is canonical deceased appearing alive in a contemporary scene. The character of Sideshow Bob has killed and been killed in a number of Treehouse of Horror episodes, which as noted are officially non-canonical and therefore do not create continuity errors when Sideshow Bob subsequently appears alive in regular episodes. But Sideshow Bob's complicated relationship with the show's regular continuity does produce one specific documented error. In a regular continuity episode from a later season, Bob is shown to have died as a result of events depicted in a previous episode, only for him to return without explanation in a subsequent episode. The explanation eventually offered within the show that Bob survived somehow is general enough that it does not quite account for the specific circumstances of the apparent death, but it is an attempt at continuity that most shows in similar situations do not bother to make. Krusty the Clown's father, Rabbi Hyman Kristofsky, dies in the season 25 episode What Animated Women Want. The death is given genuine narrative weight as part of the episode's storyline, and it is the kind of death, an elderly character passing peacefully, that feels clearly permanent. But Hyman Kristofsky subsequently appears alive in the background of at least one later episode, raising the same question as the other post-death appearances. Was this a deliberate choice? A Treehouse of Horror-style alternate continuity, or simply a production error where a background character model was placed without awareness of the character's canonical status? The pattern across these cases suggests that most of Springfield's returning dead are production errors rather than deliberate choices. The show has enough background character models in circulation, and the production pipeline is large enough that keeping track of which background figures are canonically deceased and therefore should not appear in present-day crowd scenes is a genuinely difficult task. A character who was significant enough to have their death treated with narrative weight in their primary episode may be known to the writer and director of that episode, but may not be flagged in the background modeling reference materials used by the animation team several seasons later. This is not an excuse for the errors. It is an explanation of the mechanism that produces them. And it is, in its way, a gentle reminder of the enormous volume of detail that a show of this length and complexity must track a volume so large that some things will inevitably slip through. There is one more category of death-related error in The Simpsons that is worth discussing, and it is, in some ways, the most philosophically interesting. The category of characters who are not killed within the show, but who were associated with voice actors who died in real life. Phil Hartman voiced several Simpsons characters, most notably Troy McClure and Lionel Hutz. When Hartman died in 1998, the show retired both characters rather than recast them, a decision made out of respect for Hartman and for the specific quality of the character's performances, which were so thoroughly identified with his voice that replacing him seemed impossible. This was the right decision, and it produced two characters who exist in a kind of permanent ellipsis present in the show's history, referenced occasionally, but not reappearing as active participants in the narrative. They did not die within the show, they simply stopped appearing. But Troy McClure and Lionel Hutz have both been visible in background settings after their practical retirement, appearing in crowd scenes or incidental background positions in episodes from after Hartman's death. These appearances are clearly production errors of the same type as the post-death character reappearances. Background models placed without specific attention to which characters they represented and what the show's policy on those characters' continuing presence was. They are also, in their own particular way, the most bittersweet entries in the catalog of characters who appeared after they should not have, because these appearances are not errors of continuity within the show's fictional world. They are errors of continuity with a real loss, visible briefly in the backgrounds of scenes before the camera moves on. Section 7. The writer's room left the door open. The most sustained and most interesting errors in The Simpsons are not visual. They are not in the colors or the clothing or the spatial arrangement of the buildings. They are in the words and the things characters say across different episodes that cannot both be true, in the facts the show establishes and then quietly abandons, in the moments where a writer in one season introduced a detail that a writer in a different season contradicted without knowing it. Continuity errors in dialogue and screenplay are the errors that require the most attention to find, and they are the errors that reveal the most about how a show of this complexity is actually made. They are the evidence of individual creative decisions making contact with other individual creative decisions across years and sometimes decades, in ways that produce contradictions the writers never intended. Let us begin with one of the most thoroughly documented categories: the matter of what Homer does and does not know. Homer's ignorance is a running theme of the show. He doesn't know things that other people know. He forgets things that he has previously learned. He fails to make connections that seem obvious. This is both a source of comedy and a character-defining trait. Homer's limited awareness of his own situation is part of what makes him simultaneously frustrating and endearing. But there is a specific subcategory of Homer's ignorance that produces genuine continuity errors, the moments where Homer does not know something that the show has previously established he knows. In one episode, Homer demonstrates genuine expertise in a particular subject, wine, or classical music, or a specific historical period in a way that is treated as a real display of knowledge. In a later episode, Homer does not know the most basic fact about that same subject, in a way that plays as a discovery moment rather than as a failure of memory. The wine example is a real one. There is an episode where Homer demonstrates some genuine wine sophistication, not sommelier-level expertise, but clearly more than the basic ignorance the character is typically shown to have. And in a later episode, Homer encounters wine in a way that plays as his first real engagement with it, with no knowledge of the subject and no indication that he has ever engaged with it before. These contradictions are not always this clean. Sometimes they are more subtle, a difference in how thoroughly Homer knows a particular person's name, or a difference in his familiarity with a location he has previously been shown to know well. The show's writers use Homer's knowledge level as a variable, adjusting it to suit whatever the current episode requires, and the accumulated record of those adjustments produces a portrait of a man who knows and does not know the same things in ways that cannot be simultaneously true. The matter of Mr. Burns failing to know Homer's name is one of the show's most persistent running jokes. Burns has employed Homer for years. He cannot remember Homer's name. This is a well-established gag and it is funny, but it creates a continuity problem, because there are episodes where Burns does know Homer's name where he addresses him correctly, where the familiarity between them is at a level that assumes the name is known, and these episodes exist alongside the episodes where the forgetting is the point. The forgetting the name joke is better understood as a characterization choice than as a consistent fact about Burns's knowledge of Homer. The joke is about Burns's dismissive attitude toward his employees, not about an actual consistent memory deficit. But when viewed as a factual matter, does Burns know Homer's name or not? The record is contradictory. Bart's relationship with his teachers is another area where the show's continuity has specific, documented errors. Mrs. Crabapple teaches Bart's class. Their relationship is well established, she is tired and defeated, he is anarchic and creative, and their dynamic is one of the show's most reliably comic, ongoing relationships. In most episodes, the specific contours of this relationship are consistent. Mrs. Crabapple knows what Bart is capable of. She has expectations of him, usually low, and she reacts to his behavior with a world weariness that speaks of years of accumulated frustration. But there are episodes where Mrs. Crabapple appears to be encountering Bart for something close to the first time, where her reaction to his behavior suggests an unfamiliarity that does not fit their established history. These episodes are usually written to introduce a specific new dynamic or to set up a particular joke, and the slight departure from established continuity is the cost of making the episode work on its own terms. The principal and Mrs. Crabapelle's romantic relationship is one of the show's most gradual and most uneven continuity situations. Their relationship has been developed, walked back, redeveloped, and modified across many episodes in ways that are individually sensible but which, in aggregate, produce a timeline of their relationship that does not hang together coherently. There are episodes where they appear to be in a serious relationship. There are episodes, from roughly the same period, where they appear to be merely acquaintances. There are episodes where their relationship status is treated as a known quantity by other characters, and episodes where other characters appear unaware that any relationship exists. This kind of romantic continuity inconsistency is not unique to The Simpsons. It is a feature of essentially every long-running ensemble comedy, where the writers' desire to explore different relationship dynamics in different episodes occasionally conflicts with the accumulated fact of what the show has already established. But The Simpsons has had long enough to develop so many of these inconsistencies that they form a significant portion of the show's overall continuity error catalog. The matter of what characters remember about Springfield events is another productive area of documented error. The show has established, across many episodes, that Springfield residents tend to forget significant events that happened in the town: disasters, scandals, dramatic personal revelations, This forgetfulness is a running theme and, as discussed in the transcript material, something that the show itself comments on directly in the Principal and the Pauper episode. But the forgetfulness is not consistent. Characters who have forgotten a catastrophic event in one episode sometimes remember it in another episode. Characters who are meant to be oblivious to a particular fact demonstrate awareness of that fact in a different episode. The who knows what in Springfield is a shifting and unreliable quantity, and attempting to map it produces contradictions. The specific example of Homer's revelation that he is Maggie's biological father, in the broader sense of the family's ongoing relationship with paternity questions, has produced one of the more complex continuity threads in the show. Various episodes have introduced or implied complications about family history, and the show's handling of these complications, what is remembered, what is known, what is publicly acknowledged, is not always consistent between episodes. The matter of Springfield's institutional memory of the Burns shooting is another documented inconsistency. After the events of Who Shot Mr. Burns and the resolution that Maggie was the shooter, the show occasionally references these events in later episodes. But the specific facts referenced are not always consistent with what the episode's established characters seem to remember. Some aspects of the event differently than the episodes depicted them, and the narrative status of Maggie as the established shooter is not always treated consistently. The show's legal continuity is particularly error-prone, in part because legal proceedings in The Simpsons are almost always comic rather than realistic, and the specific outcomes and precedents established in one episode's courtroom scenes are not always honored in a later episode's legal situation. Homer has been legally cleared of various charges, convicted of others, and subjected to legal proceedings whose outcomes should logically affect subsequent episodes but often do not. Specific legal precedents established in the show's Springfield Chief Wiggum's occasionally creative approach to law enforcement, the various judges' rulings, the specific legal framework within which Lionel Hutz operated are not always consistent between the episodes that establish them. This is, again, partly by design. The show is not a legal procedural, and it has never pretended to be. Legal situations in The Simpsons are comic situations first and legal situations second, and the specific details of legal outcomes are treated as fungible as any other detail of Springfield's reality. But the accumulated record of legal outcomes and precedents in Springfield is a genuinely interesting document of contradiction. There are episodes where Homer's prior legal history should logically affect how he is treated in a current legal situation, and where it does not. There are episodes where the specific laws of Springfield are stated clearly, and later episodes where those laws are either forgotten or reversed. And there are episodes where the legal system functions in a way that directly contradicts how it functioned in an earlier episode involving the same characters in a similar situation. The show's handling of academic continuity is another rich area. Springfield Elementary is the setting for many episodes, and the academic life of the school grades, promotions, academic consequences, teacher-student relationships is handled with varying degrees of consistency. Bart has been in 4th grade for 36 years. His academic struggles are one of the show's running themes, and yet specific academic consequences, failing tests, being held back, receiving specific grades are not always consistent between episodes. An episode that establishes Bart as having received a specific academic outcome should logically affect his situation in later episodes, but the floating timeline and the reset between episodes convention means that these outcomes rarely persist. Lisa's academic achievements are similarly inconsistent. She is established as an exceptional student, but the specific details of her academic record, what she is learning, what level she is operating at, what her teachers expect of her vary between episodes in ways that suggest different writers having different ideas about what exceptional means for an 8-year-old. The show's treatment of Bart and Lisa's relationship with their classmates is also inconsistently handled. Characters who are established as significant classmates in one episode, friends, enemies, or notable presences in the school's social ecosystem, sometimes disappear entirely from later episodes and then reappear as if they had never been away. The social dynamics of Springfield Elementary shift and reconfigure with each episode, and the accumulated picture of what that social world actually looks like is a composite that no single episode ever quite assembles. Section 8. Homer's job and every other job he has ever had. Homer Simpson is the safety inspector at the Springfield nuclear power plant. This is his job. It is the job he held at the beginning of the show. It is the job he holds now. In between, he has also been a food critic, a country music manager, a boxer, a monorail conductor, a missionary, a paparazzo, a vigilante, a member of a barbershop quartet, a snowplow operator, a volunteer fire chief, a personal assistant, a telemarketer, a pizza delivery person, a carnival worker, a mascot, a hippie, a soldier, an astronaut, a pet psychiatrist, an inventor, a union leader, a trucker, a fisherman, a lighthouse keeper, an actor, a voice actor, and several dozen other occupations, depending on which season you are watching. The show's running conceit of Homer getting new jobs for individual episodes is one of its most productive comedic conventions. It gives the writers unlimited flexibility to drop the Simpsons family into new situations, expose Homer to new environments, and generate comedy from his characteristic approach: enthusiastic, short-sighted, surprisingly capable in specific moments, and catastrophically incompetent in others, being applied to the demands of whatever field he has entered this week. But this convention also produces one of the show's most extensive catalogs of continuity errors, because each new job Homer takes on should, in theory, have some continuing effect on his life. Skills he acquires should persist. Money he earns or loses should affect the family's finances. Professional connections he makes should be available to him in subsequent episodes. Legal or professional consequences he faces should follow him. They almost never do. The most well-documented category of Homer job errors involves the direct contradiction between skills demonstrated in one episode and the apparent absence of those skills in a later episode. In a Season 3 episode, Homer demonstrates a specific practical skill, let us say, some form of mechanical competence with a facility that suggests genuine ability. In a later episode, he encounters the identical situation and approaches it with complete ignorance, as though the earlier demonstration of competence had never occurred. This pattern repeats across many of Homer's temporary careers. He becomes a chef. He demonstrates cooking ability that is genuinely impressive. In subsequent episodes, Homer's cooking is a reliable source of comedy precisely because it is terrible. He becomes an artist. He creates work of surprising quality. In subsequent episodes, Homer's artistic sense is as limited as ever. He becomes a musician. He performs with competence and apparent joy. In subsequent episodes, Homer's relationship with music is as musically naive as it has always been. The explanation that the show provides, implicitly, is the same floating timeline logic that explains why Bart never ages. Homer's competencies belong to the episodes in which they appear, not to any ongoing personal development. He acquires skills for the duration of an episode and then releases them, returning to the default Homer for the next story. This is fine as storytelling strategy. It is a direct continuation of the episodic comedy tradition that defines the show. But, from a continuity perspective, it produces a Homer whose personal history of demonstrated competence is both vast and meaningless. A man who has done nearly everything and learned nothing lasting from any of it. The power plant itself is the central location for Homer's professional life, and its internal continuity has its own extensive catalog of errors. The layout of the power plant changes between episodes. The specific area where Homer works, Sector 7G, has a different configuration in different episodes. The equipment he is responsible for monitoring varies. The colleagues who share the space with him are sometimes consistent between episodes and sometimes completely different. The safety violations that are such a prominent feature of the plant's characterization are stated in different terms and with different specifics in different episodes. Homer's direct colleagues at the plant, Lenny Leonard and Carl Carlson, the closest things he has to a consistent professional community, have their own continuity errors. Their rank and seniority relative to Homer shift between episodes. Their knowledge of and relationship with the plant's operations is handled inconsistently. And their personal histories, which are occasionally explored in episodes dedicated to their characters, have the same floating timeline instability as the main family's histories. Lenny's last name is itself a documented point of confusion. In some episodes, it appears to be Leonard. In others, the characters treat Lenny as a first name attached to a different surname. Across the show's run, enough different specific facts about Lenny's personal history have been established that they produce contradictions when examined together. Carl's racial and cultural identity, which is treated with more consistency than most secondary character backgrounds in the show, has nonetheless been subjected to the occasional continuity error in episodes where background details about his family or upbringing are introduced that sit uncomfortably with previously established facts. The power plant's nuclear material, the specific type of radioactive material involved in the plant's operation, is described differently in different episodes. In some episodes, specific isotopes are named. In others, the material is described in more general terms. And the specific safety protocols associated with the material, while never the show's primary focus, are handled differently enough between episodes that the plant's internal operations are inconsistent on a technical level. The plant's management structure above Burns is another area of inconsistency. Burns is the owner and ultimate authority. But who sits between Burns and the frontline workers like Homer in the management hierarchy changes between episodes. Smithers is a constant, always Burns's right hand, always the operational interface between the owner and everyone else, but the specific management layers between Smithers and the plant floor are not consistently defined. Homer's pay grade and specific salary at the plant is a documented point of inconsistency. Specific dollar amounts for Homer's income are given in various episodes, and these amounts are not always consistent with each other. More significantly, Homer's apparent standard of living fluctuates in ways that do not always track with the income level suggested by his stated salary. There are episodes where the family is genuinely poor, unable to afford ordinary expenses. There are episodes where Homer has access to substantial discretionary income without any explanation of where it came from. This financial inconsistency is partly a reflection of the show's episodic storytelling convention. The family's finances are whatever the current episode requires, and partly the result of different writers having different intuitions about what the Simpsons' income level actually is. The show is set in a working-class community, and Homer's job at the power plant is meant to be a relatively modest union job. But the specific details of what that means financially are not fixed, and the resulting portrait of the family's economic situation across 36 seasons is a patchwork that does not cohere into a single consistent picture. Homer's various non-plant jobs are a similarly rich source of specific continuity questions. When Homer becomes the town's snowplow operator, for example, his subsequent interactions with snow and snowstorms in later episodes do not reflect the experience and expertise that the snowplow episode established. When Homer takes a job that gives him specific knowledge of a particular industry or institution, later episodes where that industry or institution is relevant do not consistently treat Homer as someone who has that background. The most famous example of job-related continuity error is probably the matter of Homer's NASA connection. In the Season 5 episode Deep Space Homer, Homer is recruited by NASA and ultimately goes to space. He travels to a space shuttle. He floats in microgravity. He becomes, briefly, an astronaut. This is a significant life event. It is the kind of thing that would define a person's self-conception and public identity for years. In the world of real people, Homer's spaceflight would be a permanent fixture of how he introduced himself and how others introduced him. He would be Homer, the guy who went to space, forever. In the world of The Simpsons, Homer's spaceflight is mentioned occasionally in subsequent episodes as a reference, but it does not consistently affect how Homer relates to space-related topics, science-related topics, or situations where the credibility of being a former astronaut would be relevant. There are episodes where Homer's spaceflight is treated as a known and established fact about him, and episodes where his relationship with scientific and technical subjects is exactly as naive as it would be if the spaceflight had never happened. This is the floating timeline convention applied to personal history rather than to age. Homer's experiences belong to the episodes where they occur and do not accumulate into a permanently changed person. The job that produces the single most specific and most documented continuity error in the show's history is probably the food critic position, and the error it produces involves not Homer's skills but his physical experience of food, something that the show has otherwise established as one of Homer's most reliable and most consistent traits. Homer's relationship with food is perhaps the most thoroughly established aspect of his character. He eats. He loves eating. He eats things that other people would not eat, in quantities that other people would not attempt, with an enthusiasm that is one of his most defining characteristics. The specific foods he loves, donuts, primarily, but also a long list of other items, are so well established that they are part of the cultural vocabulary around the character. And yet, there are specific episodes where Homer's relationship with food, what he likes, what he knows about it, how he approaches it is inconsistent with the baseline that the show has established. An episode where Homer demonstrates genuine food sophistication sits alongside an episode where his food knowledge is basic. An episode where Homer tries a food he has apparently never encountered before sits alongside an earlier episode where that same food was clearly familiar to him. These are small things. They are the kind of thing that only registers if you have been watching the show closely for a long time and have developed a sense of what baseline Homer looks like across many episodes. But they are there, documented, and they are part of what makes the show's continuity so rich an area of inquiry. Section 9. The Guest Star Graveyard. The Simpsons has featured more celebrity guest appearances than any other animated series in television history. This is not a contested claim. The list of guests runs to hundreds of names, spanning every conceivable category of celebrity musicians, actors, politicians, athletes, comedians, directors, scientists, writers, and representing essentially every decade of the show's existence. Most of these guest appearances are straightforward. A celebrity plays a version of themselves, interacts with the Springfield characters for the duration of a scene or an episode, and departs without complication. But a significant number of guest appearances have left behind continuity complications that have never been fully resolved cases where the celebrity's presence in one episode created a canonical fact about Springfield's world that subsequent episodes either ignored or directly contradicted. The most fundamental category of guest appearance continuity error involves the question of celebrity recognition. When a celebrity guest appears as themselves in Springfield, other characters typically recognize them and react with appropriate excitement. This is part of the appeal of the celebrity cameo as a comedic device. But it creates a canonical fact. This celebrity exists in Springfield's world, and at least some Springfield residents know who they are. The problem arises when the same celebrity or a character portrayed by the same celebrity appears again in a later episode in a different context, without acknowledgement of the earlier encounter. Homer meets a specific musician in Season 5. In Season 12, Homer meets that same musician again, in circumstances that imply this is a first meeting, without any reference to the earlier encounter. This is partly the floating timeline convention again, previous encounters reset along with everything else between episodes. But it is also a genuine continuity error, and it is one that the show's celebrity-heavy later seasons produce with increasing frequency. The matter of what Springfield residents know about specific celebrities is also inconsistently handled. In some episodes, a character demonstrates knowledge of or enthusiasm for a specific celebrity that is treated as an established fact about their personality. In a later episode, that same character encounters the same celebrity or a reference to that celebrity with apparent unfamiliarity. Lisa's relationship with various musicians she has admired is a particularly productive area for this kind of error. Lisa's musical tastes and enthusiasms are well established, and she is the character who most often interacts with musical celebrities in ways that should leave lasting impressions. But the specific details of her musical knowledge and her encounters with her musical heroes are not always consistent between the episodes that depict them. The most extensively documented celebrity continuity error in the show involves an instance where the same actor appeared as two different characters across different episodes playing, in one appearance, a character who is clearly a distinct fictional person, and in another appearance, playing a guest version of themselves, with both appearances existing in the same canonical continuity. This is a structural problem that arises from the show's frequent use of celebrity guest voices. When a celebrity is cast as a one-off fictional character in an early season and then later appears as a version of themselves, the show has effectively put the same voice in two different canonical roles, and if both episodes are treated as occurring in the same continuity, then Springfield contains a fictional character who happens to be voiced by, and is therefore indistinguishable from, a celebrity who also exists within that same continuity. The show typically resolves this by treating each appearance as if the previous one did not happen, which is, in essence, the same strategy it applies to most continuity problems. The audience is not meant to track which characters are played by which guest stars across multiple appearances. The immediate entertainment value of the current episode is the point, and connecting it to the history of the guest's previous appearances would be a distraction. But the canon-minded viewer, watching closely, notices. And what they notice is a Springfield in which, If you look at the full cast of characters across all episodes and attempt to construct a coherent single world from them, there are multiple instances of the same voice, the same face, the same apparent person existing in two or more distinct roles. The historical guest appearances, celebrities who appeared as historical figures in flashback episodes, or as versions of historical figures in the show's various period pieces, have their own continuity complications. A historical figure depicted in one flashback episode may be depicted differently, or in a slightly different context, in a later flashback. The specific facts established about that historical figure's relationship to Springfield in one episode may be inconsistent with what is established in another. This is partly a research and consistency issue. Getting the details of historical figures right across multiple episodes, written by different writers at different times, requires a level of coordination that is difficult to maintain. But it is also partly a function of the show's willingness to use historical figures as comic material in ways that prioritize the joke over the historical record, which means that the same historical figure might be portrayed quite differently depending on what the episode's specific comedic needs are. The political guest appearances by real politicians, or by characters clearly based on specific real politicians, have produced some of the most interesting long-term continuity situations. When a real politician appears in The Simpsons in the context of their actual political moment, their presence in the episode creates a canonical fact about Springfield's relationship to the political world. And as those politicians' careers and public profiles changed over the decades that followed their appearances, the canonical fact established by the episode becomes increasingly complicated to reconcile with the show's ongoing present. A politician who appeared in the show during a period of genuine political prominence might, by the time of a later episode, have left office or changed political positions, or become a significantly different public figure than they were at the time of their original appearance. The earlier episode still exists as part of the show's history. The facts it established about that politician's presence in Springfield still stand, and subsequent episodes that deal with the same political landscape have to navigate around a historical record that includes this earlier, potentially now outdated appearance. Musical celebrity appearances have created a particularly rich set of continuity questions, because musicians' public personas and musical styles change significantly over time, and an appearance by a musician at a particular point in their career captures a specific version of that artist that may not correspond to who they are 10 or 15 years later. The show's handling of these later career contradictions is, typically, to simply not address them, to treat each appearance as a fresh engagement without reference to the changing real-world context of the celebrity's career. But for the fan who is paying attention, the accumulated weight of these appearances creates a portrait of Springfield's celebrity relationships that is anchored to specific moments in time, in a way that sits uneasily with the floating timeline's insistence on a perpetual present. There is also the purely mechanical category of guest voice casting error. Instances where a celebrity was announced as appearing in an episode, but the credited voice in the final episode appears to be different from what was announced, or where a celebrity's voice was used in a way that created a discrepancy between the announced role and the apparent role in the finished episode. These casting-level errors are rare and relatively minor, but they have been documented in a small number of cases and represent the most basic category of guest appearance error, the one that lives not in the content of the episode but in the gap between what the production intended and what the audience received. The cumulative effect of 36 years of celebrity guest appearances on the show's continuity is considerable. Springfield is a town that has been visited by hundreds of famous people, witnessed by millions of viewers, and documented in the fan record with enough care that the inconsistencies in how those famous people are integrated into the show's world are visible and mappable. The celebrity episode catalog is, in this sense, a museum of every moment when the show's desire to engage with the real world collided with its fictional continuity, and a record of what happens when those collisions are not fully resolved. Section 10. The Treehouse of Horror Contamination. Every year, usually in October, The Simpsons airs a Halloween special. The Treehouse of Horror episodes, 33 of them, as of the most recent season, operate under a different set of rules than the regular show. They are officially non-canonical. Events that occur in the Treehouse of Horror do not count as part of the show's established history. Characters can die. Physics can be completely abandoned. The show's fictional world can be restructured or destroyed. and none of it carries over to the next regular episode. This is a reasonable and well-functioning convention. It gives the creative team enormous freedom to experiment, and it produces some of the show's most inventive and most visually ambitious material. The non-canonical status of the Treehouse episodes is established clearly enough that most viewers understand it, and it has allowed the show to revisit and kill and transform its characters repeatedly over more than 3 decades without destabilizing the regular continuity. Except that is not entirely true. The Treehouse of Horror episodes have, in a number of documented cases, contaminated the regular continuity in ways that were either unintended or inadequately considered. Characters, situations, and occasionally specific gags from the Halloween specials have appeared in regular episodes in contexts that imply a canonical status. Narrative threads that were introduced in the non-canonical specials have been referenced in the regular show in ways that treat them as established facts. And in at least a few cases, visual elements and design choices from the Treehouse episodes have appeared in regular episodes, creating a kind of aesthetic bleed between the canonical and the non-canonical that is not always easy to account for. The most common category of Treehouse contamination is the appearance of Treehouse episode-specific character designs or elements in regular continuity. A monster or creature created specifically for a Treehouse story appears as a background element in a regular episode set in what is clearly the show's normal universe. A specific visual gag or piece of background design that originated in a Halloween special is reused in a regular episode, where its presence implies it is part of the canonical world. This contamination happens most often in the area of visual gags and background details, precisely the areas where the production team has the most freedom and the least rigorous consistency checking. A background artist who liked a particular visual element from a Treehouse episode might repurpose it in a regular episode without thinking through the continuity implications. A prop or design that was introduced in a non-canonical context might be convenient enough that it gets pressed into service in the regular show, where its existence is now implied to be canonical. The second category of Treehouse contamination is more interesting from a storytelling perspective. Cases where a concept or situation introduced in a Treehouse episode is subsequently developed in the regular show in a way that retroactively blurs the line between what is canonical and what is not. This happens occasionally with character relationships. A dynamic between characters that is explored in a Treehouse context, perhaps a comedic reversal of a normal relationship, or an intensified version of an existing tension, sometimes finds its way into the regular show's treatment of those characters in a softened form that does not technically require the Treehouse events to have happened canonically, but which clearly draws on the creative territory opened up by the non-canonical episode. The third category of Treehouse contamination is the most subtle and the most interesting. Cases where the logic of Treehouse episodes has influenced how the regular show treats certain topics, even without specific canonical bleed. The Treehouse episodes have explored the show's horror-adjacent territory with a freedom and a darkness that the regular show cannot match under its own constraints. Characters die. Gruesome things happen. The darkest implications of Springfield's world are explored without the safety net of canonical status. And this exploration, over the course of 33 episodes, has gradually expanded the palette of darkness available to the regular show, not by making specific Treehouse events canonical, but by establishing that this world contains darkness, and that the regular show can approach that darkness without fully committing to it. The result is a regular show that has gradually become willing to go to darker places than it might have without the release valve of the Treehouse episodes, and the line between dark episode and, effectively, Treehouse-style content has occasionally become blurry, in ways that produce continuity complications. There is one specific Treehouse to regular continuity error that has been particularly well documented, and that illustrates the problem clearly. In a Treehouse episode from the middle seasons, a specific character undergoes a transformation that is clearly meant to be non-canonical, a fantastical change that exists only within the Halloween special frame. In a later regular episode, a reference is made to something that appears to acknowledge this transformation as having happened not explicitly, not in a way that constitutes a full canonical acknowledgement, but in a way that is hard to interpret as anything other than treating the Treehouse event as real. This ambiguous reference is the most common type of Treehouse contamination, and it is the hardest to categorize definitively as an error because the ambiguity may be intentional, a deliberate wink to fans who will recognize the reference. Or it may be an instance of a writer referencing something from the show's history without fully thinking through whether it was canonical. The Halloween episode format also creates its own specific category of internal error, inconsistencies within individual Treehouse of Horror episodes. Because these episodes consist of multiple independent segments, and because the production constraints and timeline pressures of the Halloween special format have sometimes led to a faster production pace than regular episodes receive, there are documented instances of design and animation inconsistencies within single Treehouse episodes that are more pronounced than those typically found in regular episodes. Character designs shift more dramatically between Treehouse segments than they would between acts of a regular episode, in part because different segments may be handled by different creative teams working in a more compressed time frame. Props and settings are less consistently realized, and the non-canonical status of the episodes may mean that the review and correction process for these errors is somewhat more relaxed if the events of a Treehouse episode are not going to count toward the show's established history. Errors within those episodes carry a lower cost. The result is that the Treehouse of Horror episodes, while often producing some of the show's most visually inventive and creatively ambitious material, also tend to be among the more error-dense episodes in the show's catalog, a quality that is both a consequence of their production circumstances and, in a certain light, part of their distinctive character. The contamination runs in the other direction as well. There are regular show continuity elements that have been incorporated into Treehouse episodes in ways that create their own complications. A fact established canonically in the regular show about a character's history, or a location's specifics, or a relationship between characters appears in a Treehouse episode in a form that is slightly inconsistent with the canonical version. Since the Treehouse episode is non-canonical, this inconsistency technically does not matter, but it registers in the fan record as a discrepancy, and it adds to the general sense that the line between canonical and non-canonical in The Simpsons is more porous than the official Halloween special framework would suggest. Number. Section 11. Springfield's Impossible Geography. Where is Springfield? The question has become something of a ritual in fan discussions of The Simpsons, a question that everyone knows cannot be answered, that the show has actively worked to prevent from being answered, and that gets asked anyway because the impossibility of the answer is itself fascinating. But the geographical mystery of Springfield's location is only the most dramatic version of a broader set of geographical errors that the show has accumulated across its run. Errors not just in where Springfield is, but in what Springfield contains, what is around it, how large it is, how its streets and neighborhoods are arranged, and what the physical landscape of the region looks like. We have already touched on the fact that Springfield borders, at various points, Ohio, Nevada, Maine, Kentucky, and several other states, a geographical impossibility that the show embraces rather than resolves. But beyond the state border question, Springfield's geography contains a large number of specific, documentable inconsistencies that are worth examining on their own terms. The scale of Springfield changes between episodes in ways that cannot be explained by narrative needs alone. In some episodes, Springfield is a small town, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, where major civic events are attended by the entire population, where the distance between any 2 points can be covered in a short drive or a reasonable walk. In other episodes, Springfield is clearly a much larger city, a place with distinct neighborhoods, a genuine urban core, suburban outskirts, and an industrial district of the kind that requires significant physical space. The population of Springfield is stated differently in different episodes. It has been given as several different specific numbers across the show's run, numbers that differ from each other by factors that are too large to be attributed to rounding. The town is simultaneously small enough to feel like a community where Homer and Marge are recognizable to most residents, and large enough to contain the full range of urban institutions, demographics, and anonymity that the show's plots occasionally require. The distance from Springfield to various other locations, the nearest large city, the highway, specific geographic features like mountains or the ocean, changes between episodes in ways that reflect different creative teams' intuitions about what the drive should feel like, rather than any consistent geographical fact. The relationship between Springfield and Shelbyville, the neighboring town that serves as a rival and foil, is a particular source of geographic inconsistency. In some episodes, Shelbyville is close enough to Springfield that the towns share civic events, that residents of one can easily access the other, and that the boundary between them is navigable on foot. In other episodes, the distance between the towns is treated as significantly greater, requiring more substantial travel. The Springfield Gorge, which becomes memorable in the Bart the Daredevil episode of the third season when Homer's failed motorcycle stunt down it, becomes one of the show's most iconic visual gags, appears to be located in different positions relative to the town in different episodes. The gorge is near the Simpson house in some episodes. It is described as being at a meaningful distance in others. Its specific depth and width vary between its appearances. The town's various natural landmarks, the mountain range visible in the background of many establishing shots, the river that runs near town, the forest that appears at the edge of the community in certain stories are positioned inconsistently relative to each other and relative to the town's built environment. An establishing shot that shows the mountain range to the north in one episode will show it to the east in another. The harbor is among the most inconsistently positioned major landmarks in Springfield's geography. In some episodes, Springfield's harbor is accessible from the town center in a relatively short time, as befitting a coastal town with a working waterfront. In other episodes, the harbor appears to require a significant journey to reach, and its position relative to the town's other landmarks does not match its position in the episodes where it is closer. Springfield's nuclear power plant is positioned near the river in most establishing shots and aerial views of the town. This is consistent with real nuclear plant siting conventions. Power plants need large water supplies for cooling, and it is one of the more geographically stable facts about Springfield's layout. But the specific position of the plant relative to the residential parts of town shifts between episodes, and the route characters take to get from the residential areas to the plant changes between scenes in ways that are inconsistent with any fixed floor plan of the city. The Springfield Elementary School's position relative to the Simpson house is a specific, documented inconsistency. The children walk to school in some episodes, suggesting a relatively short distance. The walk appears to take different amounts of time in different episodes, and the specific route between the house and the school the streets walked, the landmarks passed, is not consistent between episodes that show the journey. The town has an airport. The airport appears in a number of episodes and is used as a plot device whenever a character needs to travel or arrive by plane. Its position relative to the town is inconsistent between episodes. Sometimes it appears to be close to the town center, and sometimes it appears to require a significant drive to reach. The airport's facilities change between appearances, and its scale, the number of gates, the size of the terminal, the services available varies significantly. Springfield's commercial districts have one of the more interesting geographic continuity problems. The show has established several distinct commercial areas in Springfield: a downtown area, a shopping mall, various strip mall corridors, and the relationships between these areas change between episodes. A character who walks out of a store in what appears to be a downtown commercial area in one episode emerges from what appears to be a suburban strip mall in another episode, despite the show's implication that these are the same or neighboring locations. The Quickie Mart's position is one of the more extensively documented specific geographic inconsistencies. The Quickie Mart is one of the show's central and most frequently visited locations. It is operated by Apu, and its presence in the neighborhood is well established. But its specific position relative to other landmarks in the neighborhood, the Simpson house, Moe's Tavern, the school, is not consistent between episodes. In some episodes, the Quickie Mart is within easy walking distance of the Simpson house. In others, it appears to require a drive. The streets between the two locations shift between episodes. Moe's Tavern's geographic position is similarly inconsistent. Moe's is established as Homer's local bar, close enough to be a default destination, accessible without significant travel. But the specific position of Moe's relative to the Simpson house and the specific street configuration surrounding it varies between episodes. The neighborhood visible through Moe's front window, when the window is visible at all, is not always the same. The specific town layout of Springfield has been mapped by fans on numerous occasions, using the geographic information available from the show's various episodes. The results of these mapping attempts are remarkably consistent with each other, and they are remarkably inconsistent with the show's actual depiction of Springfield across its full run. The maps that fans produce are plausible, coherent, and internally consistent. They are also largely incompatible with specific episodes that place locations in positions that do not fit the map. This is because the maps are necessarily constructed from a subset of episodes chosen for the relative consistency of their geographic information. Including all episodes and treating all geographic information as equally valid produces a Springfield that cannot be mapped to town whose streets and landmarks exist in the same quantum architectural state as the Simpson house's basement. And this, ultimately, is the most honest geographical statement about Springfield. It is a place defined by how it feels rather than where things are. You know what Springfield feels like. You know what the drive to Moe's feels like. You know what the walk from the school to the house feels like. You know what the power plant looks like on the horizon. These are emotional and experiential facts, not cartographic ones. Springfield lives in the feeling of a place, not in the measurement of it. The errors in its geography are not failures to be true to a specific place. They are the inevitable result of a show being true to the feeling of many places all at once. Section 12. The final catalog. We have been in Springfield for a long time now. We have walked through the rooms that cannot exist. We have watched the shirts change color between scenes. We have sat with Homer across all his impossible jobs and forgotten competencies. We have noted the dead who returned and the stories that contradicted themselves and the timeline that keeps swallowing its own tail. This final section is for the errors that did not fit cleanly into the previous categories, and for the ones that do fit but deserve a second, quieter mention before we finish. Think of it as the bottom of the box, the place where you find the things that were too specific or too strange or too small to go anywhere else, but that are worth finding nonetheless. There is the matter of the Simpsons family's eye color. In most episodes, Homer's eyes, when they are depicted in sufficient close-up to have a specific color, appear to be a sort of undefined dark. Marge's eyes have a slight blue tint in some episodes and are simply dark in others. The children's eyes, being the simple design of the show's general character style, do not have a consistent, specific color. In a small number of episodes, predominantly from the early seasons, there are close-up shots where the character's eyes appear with a specific color that is not used in other episodes or other close-ups of the same character in different episodes. These are brief, they are rare, and they are almost certainly production errors in the color rendering of specific shots. But they are the kind of error that, once you are aware of it, causes you to look very carefully at every close-up of a character's face, just in case. The matter of what the television in the Simpson living room shows. The television set is almost constantly on in the Simpson home. This is one of the show's most consistent and most intentional visual details. The television is always there, always running, part of the ambient furniture of the family's life, in a way that is both realistic and thematic. But what the television shows is not always consistent. In the background of scenes where the television is running, the content visible on screen sometimes changes between shots within the same scene. The color changes. The apparent program changes. In some cases, the screen appears to be showing the reflection of the room rather than a broadcast, when earlier or later shots in the same scene show it clearly displaying a program. These television content errors are among the most ambient and least disruptive errors in the show's catalog, because most viewers are not focusing on the television within the television during scenes focused on the characters. But they are there, and they add a layer of gentle visual incoherence to the show's most central location. The school bus that transports the Springfield elementary children appears in numerous episodes. Otto, the driver, is one of the show's most beloved recurring characters. And the bus itself, its color, its condition, its specific features is surprisingly inconsistent across its many appearances. The shade of yellow changes between episodes. The specific damage visible on the bus's exterior dents, scrapes, missing panels varies. In some episodes, the bus appears to be in significantly better or worse condition than in neighboring episodes, without any narrative explanation for the change. The bus's interior is also inconsistent. The seating configuration changes. The specific objects visible inside the bus trash, equipment, Otto's personal belongings are not the same between appearances. And in at least one documented instance, the bus appears to be shorter on the interior than on the exterior, a spatial impossibility that is, at this point, one of the less surprising entries in the show's architectural error catalog. The matter of Springfield's trees is a small but charming category of geographic visual inconsistency. The trees visible in establishing shots and background scenes of Springfield change between episodes in ways that suggest either an unusually active urban forestry program or an animation pipeline in which the specific tree references used by different teams were not fully synchronized. The species of trees visible in comparable shots of the same street change, the seasonal state of the trees in leaf, bare, budding, is sometimes inconsistent within episodes set in the same narrative season. This is one of those errors that is genuinely invisible unless you are paying close attention to backgrounds, and therefore it is one of the most purely delightful entries in the catalog. Nobody is watching The Simpsons to check the trees, and yet the trees are different. They have always been different. They will probably continue to be different. The matter of the school chalkboard that appears in the opening sequence is a rich and well-documented area that technically falls outside the show's regular episode content, but which is worth a mention. The chalkboard gag in The Simpsons opening sequence shows Bart writing a specific phrase on the classroom chalkboard as a form of punishment. These phrases change every episode and have become one of the show's most celebrated ongoing creative traditions. But in a small number of episodes, the chalkboard in the opening sequence has contained errors, misspellings, grammatical inconsistencies, phrases that are harder to read than they should be for a sequence that depends on legibility. These errors are, in some ways, the most visible errors in the entire show's catalog, because the chalkboard appears in the first minute of every episode. But they have also been among the most forgiving errors in the fan reception, because the chalkboard gags are created under the same deadline pressures as everything else, and a slightly imperfect chalkboard gag is still a chalkboard gag. The music continuity of the show is another area with specific documented inconsistencies. The show uses a large library of recurring musical themes and cues that are associated with specific characters, situations, and emotional contexts. These themes are generally handled consistently, and the show's musical identity, established largely by Danny Elfman's original score and extended by Alf Clausen's decades of subsequent scoring work, is one of its most recognizable and most beloved elements. But there are episodes where the wrong musical cue is used for a situation where a cue associated with one character or one emotional register is used in a context where a different cue would have been more appropriate, and these musical mismatches register as errors to viewers who have internalized the show's musical vocabulary. The errors are subtle, they are brief, and most viewers would not identify them as mistakes without a musical reference. But they exist, they have been documented, and they add a layer to the error catalog that involves hearing rather than seeing. The show's sound effects have a similar inconsistency history. Specific sound effects associated with specific situations, the sound of Homer's car, the sound of the front door, the specific tone of the phone in the Simpson house are not always consistent between episodes. The variations are small enough to be invisible in isolation, but noticeable to a viewer who has watched the show enough times to have internalized what these familiar sounds should sound like. The matter of the characters' voices is a more delicate subject, because voice actor performance is not susceptible to the same kind of definitive error categorization as animation or continuity mistakes. Performances vary. Actors have different days. A character's voice might be pitched slightly differently in one episode than in another, might have a slightly different quality or emphasis, might convey a different emotional register. But there are specific documented cases where a character's voice in one episode is different enough from the established baseline that it registers as an inconsistency rather than simply as natural performance variation. This is most noticeable in secondary and background characters, where voice work is less frequently revisited and where the specific characteristics of the character's voice are less deeply established in the audience's ear. Recurring background characters who speak infrequently, who might have lines in 5 or 10 episodes across the show's entire run, are the most susceptible to voice inconsistency because there are fewer reference points for what the voice should sound like, and because the voice actor may be returning to the character after a gap long enough that the precise calibration of the performance has drifted slightly. The matter of how characters age within flashback episodes, and specifically how the show depicts characters at various points in their youth, produces a specific category of error that involves character design rather than voice. When the show depicts a young Homer, a young Marge, a young Abe, or other characters in the period before the show's present begins, it has to make design choices about what these characters looked like at a younger age. These design choices are not always consistent between flashback episodes that are meant to depict the same period in a character's life. A young Homer in one flashback does not always look the same as a young Homer in a different flashback set in the same approximate time period. The differences can be subtle, a slightly different face shape, a different hair design for the period, or they can be more significant departures that suggest the character design for the flashback version was created independently for each episode without a consistent reference for what that young version should look like. This creates a situation where the same character, at the same age, in the same approximate period, looks visibly different between flashback episodes. For characters whose youth is visited multiple times and Homer's is the most frequently revisited, the accumulated inconsistencies in the flashback design produce a portrait of a person's younger self that is not entirely coherent. The matter of continuity between episode teaser sequences and the main body of episodes is another small but persistent source of error. The Simpsons episodes often begin with a short teaser segment, a self-contained scene that precedes the main title sequence, and in a number of episodes the teaser sequence contains specific visual or narrative details that are not entirely consistent with details established in the main body of the episode. These are typically small discrepancies, a room that looks slightly different in the teaser than in the main episode, a piece of clothing that is not quite the same, a background element that changes. They are most likely the result of teasers occasionally being produced or completed on a slightly different timeline than the main episode body, with a small gap in the consistency checking between the two. The final category for this section, and the one that feels most appropriate to end on given the purpose and spirit of this video, is the category of errors that are so small, so gentle, and so completely harmless that they serve primarily as evidence of humanity, as small proof that the show was made by people who were doing their best under considerable pressure, producing something extraordinary over a remarkable span of time, and occasionally getting a detail slightly wrong in the process. There is the scene where a character picks up a cup of coffee and puts it down on a table, and in the next shot the cup is on the other side of the table, equidistant from where they were sitting, but on the other side of the center line, as though a prop hand reached in between shots and moved it without understanding why. There is the background character in the town meeting who is wearing a hat in one shot and not wearing a hat in the next shot, and then wearing the hat again in the shot after that. There is the scene where Homer's car is parked outside the house with the nose facing the street, and then in the reverse angle is facing the other direction, as though it gently turned itself around while nobody was watching. There is the episode where Bart's room is clearly supposed to be dark, it is night, the lights are off. The mood of the scene is nocturnal, and yet a specific piece of furniture in the corner is lit with the same quality of light it would have in a daytime scene, because the lighting reference for that piece of furniture was created for a different scene and was not adjusted for the nighttime context. There is the scene where a character drinks from a glass that is clearly empty. The animation of the liquid has been forgotten or omitted, leaving a transparent container through which the background is visible, but they drink from it anyway, with the full pantomime of satisfaction that accompanies a good drink, because the performance reference was provided and the performance was animated perfectly, and only the glass itself remembers that there was never anything in it. These are the errors that feel most like life. The ones where you can almost see the long day in the animation studio, the deadline approaching, the scene getting finished, the episode going out into the world. The ones that do not diminish anything. The ones that make the show feel, for a moment, like something that was made in a specific place by specific people at a specific time, not a permanent monument, but a living thing that accumulated its 36 years one episode at a time. The Simpsons has earned its monument status. It earns it every time someone laughs at something they have seen before and finds it fresh again. It earns it every time someone comes to the show for the first time and discovers that it has more in it than they were prepared for. But it earns it in a different way too, in the details. In the couch that started brown and became green, in the shirt that was white except when it wasn't, in the room that gained and lost a window, in Maude briefly alive in a crowd scene, in the glass that was empty and was drunk from anyway. These are the small, quiet errors that run through the show like fine cracks in old tiles, not structural damage, not failures, just evidence of time and effort and human hands. Springfield was built over 36 years, one frame at a time. It was built in the dark, under pressure, by people who cared about it enormously and who could not catch everything. The things they missed are part of the record now. They belong to the show as much as any of the things they got right. And so we end, not with a definitive catalog, such a thing would require volumes, but with an appreciation for the scale of what was attempted, for the enormous, improbable achievement of making something this vast and this loved, and for the small human errors that are scattered through it like seeds, waiting to be found by anyone patient enough to look. Springfield is still there. The plant is still running. Homer is still in his chair. Bart is still 10 years old and always will be. And somewhere in the frame, just out of easy sight, a chair is the wrong color, a window is in the wrong wall, and a character is standing exactly where they should not be. It is somehow perfect. Thank you for spending 4 hours in Springfield with me tonight. Drop your location and the time you are watching from in the comments below. I want to know where this found you. And whenever you are ready, whenever this has done what you needed it to do, go to sleep. Springfield will still be here when you come back. It always is. End of script. 4 hours of Simpsons mistakes to fall asleep to V2.0. Before we move on from our foundational section, let us spend a little more time with the actual mechanics of how the show was made, because understanding the production pipeline helps explain not just why errors occurred, but why specific types of errors occurred in specific types of episodes. The Simpsons, from its earliest seasons, was produced using a process that is common in American network animation. A script is completed in Los Angeles, approved by the network, handed to a director who creates a detailed animatic or story reel, essentially a filmed version of the storyboard, with temporary voice recordings, and then that animatic is sent to an overseas animation studio for final execution. In the case of The Simpsons, the primary overseas partner for many years was ACOM, a South Korean studio, along with Rough Draft Studios. These studios employed large teams of animators who would take the storyboards, the character model sheets, the color guides, and the detailed production notes sent from the American production office, and turn them into the finished, hand-drawn animation that would eventually be broadcast. This pipeline has many steps, and each step is a potential point of error. The storyboard might be unclear about a specific character's position in a scene. The model sheet for a secondary character might be incomplete or slightly inconsistent with the model sheet used for a different episode. The color guide might specify a color that the overseas studio's available inks or paints can only approximate. The detailed production notes might be misread, or might be translated imperfectly, or might arrive missing a page. And then the finished animation would come back to the American production team, and the review process would begin. The director would check the animation against the storyboard. The producers would check it against the script. Network standards and practices would check it for content. And somewhere in all of that checking, some things would be caught and fixed, and some things would not. The things that were not caught fall into a few predictable categories. Things that were only visible for a few frames, or in a small portion of a busy background, or in a shot that was not a focal point of the scene. Things that required knowledge of a different episode to identify as wrong, where the error was only visible as an error if you knew what the correct version looked like from a previous episode. Things that were close enough to correct that they passed without flagging in the review, a shirt color that was slightly wrong but in the same family as the correct color, a character position that was slightly off but not disruptively so. These categories explain the distribution of Simpsons errors, why there are many more background errors than foreground errors, why there are more subtle color errors than dramatic ones, and why so many of the most significant errors involve character history and continuity rather than visual design. Because continuity errors require cross-episode knowledge to identify, and the review process for a given episode typically focused on that episode in isolation. The season-to-season evolution of the review process is also worth noting. As the show grew in status and budget, as it became clear that this was not just a modestly successful new cartoon but a cultural phenomenon of the first order, the production process was refined. Quality control improved. The model sheets were standardized more rigorously. Color guides became more precise. The communication between the American production office and the overseas animation studios became more sophisticated. This improvement is visible in the error record. The density of animation errors in the first 2 seasons is meaningfully higher than in the 4th and 5th seasons, which are in turn somewhat more error-prone than the 7th and 8th seasons. The show's visual consistency generally improved as it went on, at least up to a certain point. Later seasons introduced digital animation tools that changed the nature of potential errors. Digital production eliminates some categories of human error while introducing others, particularly around consistency of digital assets across episodes. The digital transition in animation during the mid-2000s changed the Simpsons error landscape in ways that are documented but not always fully appreciated. Traditional hand-drawn animation errors tend to be organic, a line that wobbles, a color that drifts, a proportion that shifts. Digital animation errors tend to be more mechanical, an asset that does not load correctly, a lighting model that applies inconsistently, a character rig that produces an unintended pose. The specific flavor of post-digital transition Simpsons errors is different from the pre-digital errors, and for connoisseurs of the genre, the two eras are distinguishable. The transition also changed the practical possibilities for error correction. With hand-drawn animation, fixing an error in an already completed episode required physically redrawing and reshooting the affected footage, which was expensive and time-consuming enough that minor errors were typically left in place. With digital animation, corrections are theoretically easier. A digital asset can be modified and re-rendered without the physical labor of a traditional animation correction. This has led to some corrections being made to Simpsons episodes in their streaming and home video releases that were not present in the original broadcasts, creating a situation where different versions of the same episode contain different errors or lack certain errors that were present in the original. This version variation phenomenon is one of the more interesting meta-level aspects of Simpsons error cataloging, because it means that the error record is not static. An error that existed in the original broadcast of an episode might be absent in the streaming version. An error that was introduced in a syndication edit might not be present in the unedited broadcast version. The Simpsons, viewed across its many different distribution channels and release formats, is not a single fixed object. It is a collection of versions, each slightly different from the others, each with its own error profile. Let us spend a little more time with color, because color is where so many of the show's most visually accessible errors live, and because the specific science of how color was managed in The Simpsons production process is more interesting than it might initially seem. The Simpsons is, of course, a yellow show. The character's skin color, that specific, saturated yellow, that has become one of the most recognizable visual signatures in American animation, was a deliberate choice made by the show's early production team. The story most often told about the choice is that a producer or network executive wanted the characters to stand out from regular television, to be immediately identifiable as something other than a standard sitcom, and the yellow skin was chosen as the clearest possible visual signal that this was not just another family comedy. What is less often discussed is how difficult that yellow is to manage across a large production. Yellow is a particularly sensitive color in animation. It is close enough to flesh tones that small variations in it can read as either too orange or too green or too pale, and different rendering processes, different types of ink, different broadcast encoding systems, different display calibrations can shift the apparent shade of yellow significantly. A character who is the correct yellow on the production studio's calibrated monitors might appear slightly different on the average television set in the average American living room. This yellow management problem is one of the underlying causes of the character color inconsistencies in the show's early seasons. The specific yellow that the show intended for its characters was described in the color guides, but it was not always reproduced precisely by every element of the production chain, and the cumulative effect of those imprecisions is visible in the early episodes. By the third season, the yellow management had improved considerably. The color guides were more precise. The overseas studio had better reference materials, and the broadcast chain was better calibrated. The yellow of Season 3 is noticeably more consistent than the yellow of Season 1, more saturated, more precisely the same across different characters and different scenes, closer to the canonical yellow that most people associate with the show. But the yellow variations that persist in the early seasons, and that occasionally resurface in later seasons, when the production conditions are right for it, are among the most charming entries in the color error catalog, because they reveal the show in the process of becoming itself. The early Simpsons yellow is the yellow of a show that is still figuring out what it looks like. The later Simpsons yellow is the yellow of a show that knows exactly what it looks like and has the production infrastructure to maintain that knowledge consistently. The background colors of Springfield are another productive area for color inconsistencies. The sky over Springfield, the color of the grass in the Simpsons' yard, the color of the exterior of the Simpson house. These environmental colors vary between episodes in ways that are partly intentional, different times of day, different weather conditions, and partly unintentional, different color references used by different production teams. The exterior of the Simpson house is a particularly well-documented example. The house is white, or it is cream, or it is a very pale yellow, or it is a slightly different shade of white adjacent that is clearly intended to be the same as the previous shots but is not quite. These are not dramatic variations, they are all in the same general family of light-colored suburban house, but they are consistent enough that they have been noted and documented by fans who watch the show. With attention to the background details that most people absorb without consciously registering. The interior colors of the Simpson house are even more variable, because interior colors are subject to lighting variations that exterior colors are not. A room that is lit one way in one scene will be lit differently in a scene set at a different time of day, and the perceived color of the walls and furniture will shift accordingly. But not all of these color shifts are intentional representations of changing light. Some of them are simply inconsistencies in the color reference, where an animator rendering a late-night scene used a different shade for the living room walls than the animator who rendered the morning scene used. The specific color of the living room couch, which we mentioned in the opening section as the show's very first documented color error, is one of the more extensively studied interior color inconsistencies, simply because the couch is visible in so many episodes and provides such a long record of color variation to examine. The couch begins, as we noted, as a brownish orange. It migrates toward a more neutral orange tan in the second season. It becomes a slightly more greenish color by the third season, and it eventually settles into the specific yellow-green that most people associate with The Simpsons' living room furniture, a color that stays relatively consistent from the mid-third season onward, with occasional minor variations. Tracing the couch's color history across the first 3 seasons is, in a very literal sense, tracing the history of the show's color management program. The couch is a fixed object in a fixed location that appears in a very large percentage of episodes. It is the perfect test subject for understanding how the show's color consistency changed over time. And the record it provides is one of gradual, imperfect improvement, more consistent over time, but never perfectly consistent, even in the latest seasons. Let us revisit the architecture question from a slightly different angle, because there is one building in Springfield whose spatial errors are particularly interesting, and that deserves more than the brief mention it received earlier. The Simpsons home has a feature that architecture fans and error catalogers have spent considerable time with: the relationship between its 2 bathrooms. In some episodes, the Simpson house has 1 bathroom, located on the 2nd floor. In other episodes, it appears to have a second bathroom somewhere on the main floor, typically referenced when multiple family members need access simultaneously, and the upstairs bathroom becomes a point of contention. The interesting thing about the 2nd bathroom is not that it exists in some episodes and not others. This kind of spatial inconsistency is by now familiar territory. What is interesting is the specific way it is handled when it does appear. The episodes where a 2nd bathroom exists typically treat its existence as unremarkable, not as a new discovery or a previously unmentioned feature, but as something that was always there. There is no moment where Homer says, "I forgot we had a downstairs bathroom." The bathroom is simply present, as though it has always been present, in an episode where it wasn't present a season ago. This is the show's standard strategy for dealing with spatial inconsistencies. Not to draw attention to them, but to proceed as though the current version of the space is the correct one. It is the same strategy used for the basement, for the garage's configuration, for the attic access. The space is whatever the current episode needs it to be, and the previous version of the space is not acknowledged. But what makes the 2nd bathroom case particularly interesting is the question it raises about how we should think about the Simpson house as a place. If the house sometimes has 2 bathrooms and sometimes has 1, and if the show treats both versions as though they are correct, then what is the true version? Is there a correct Simpson house that exists independent of any individual episode? Or is the Simpson house simply the set of all versions of itself across all episodes, with no single version being more canonical than any other? The answer, practically speaking, is probably the latter. The Simpson house is not a specific building that the show is trying to represent consistently. It is a collection of spatial experiences, kitchen experiences, living room experiences, bathroom experiences that the show assembles as needed to serve each episode's story. The feeling of the house is consistent. It always feels warm, slightly cluttered, lived in, imperfect in the specific way of a family home with 3 children and a husband who occasionally brings industrial machinery home. But the specific geometry of the house is not consistent. because the specific geometry was never what the house was about. This is a profoundly true thing about how fiction works, actually. The houses in fiction that we love most deeply are not loved because of their consistent floor plans. They are loved because of the feeling they produce, the sense of being inside a particular kind of life, in a particular kind of family, in a particular kind of world. The floor plan is secondary. The feeling is primary. And the Simpsons house, for all its spatial impossibility, produces one of the warmest and most recognizable feelings in American popular culture. The errors in its floor plan are the price of that warmth. A house that was architecturally precise would, of necessity, be less flexible. It would commit to specific room sizes, specific window placements, specific spatial relationships that would constrain what stories could be told in it. The impossibly flexible Simpson house, which grows rooms when they are needed and loses them when they are not, which has a basement when the story needs a basement, and no basement when the story does not, can serve more stories than any architecturally consistent house could. Its spatial incoherence is, in the deepest sense, a feature. The floating timeline's most dramatic single manifestation is, as most serious Simpsons fans know, the episode The Principal and the Pauper. The episode that revealed Principal Skinner to be an imposter named Armin Tamzarian. We discussed this episode briefly, in terms of its implications for Springfield's relationship with truth, but it is also worth discussing as a specific and particularly intense form of timeline error, the retroactive rewriting of a character's entire history. The Tamzarian revelation did not just introduce a new fact about Skinner, it retroactively invalidated everything established about Skinner in previous episodes. Every fact about his military service, his relationship with his mother Agnes, his specific professional history, the specific shape of his personality as a former soldier turned educator, all of these things were predicated on the assumption that Skinner was who he said he was. The revelation that he was Armin Tamzarian changed not just his current status but his entire past. The show subsequently treated this revelation as though it had not happened, or rather, as the episode itself established, the town of Springfield voted to pretend it had not happened, and the show honored that vote by returning Skinner to his previous status. But this creates a unique continuity situation. The Tamzarian revelation is canonical. It happened. And then the covering up of it is also canonical. It happened too, and the subsequent episodes treat Skinner as though neither had happened. This leaves the viewer in an interesting interpretive position. The Skinner who exists in post-Tamzarian episodes is the same Skinner who existed before visually, vocally, behaviorally, the same character. But what is his history? Is he Skinner, whose history was established in episodes before the Tamzarian reveal? Is he Tamzarian pretending to be Skinner, with a history that is itself a lie? Or is he the Springfield canonically established Skinner, whose history is whatever the town voted it to be, regardless of the facts? The episode itself answers this question legally. Judge Snyder's ruling establishes Tamzarian as the legal Skinner, and the actual Skinner is expelled from the community. Within Springfield's legal framework, the imposter is the real one. This is presented as a joke, obviously, but it is also, within the logic of the show's world, a genuine and documented fact. Every episode of The Simpsons that takes place in Springfield after this ruling is, strictly speaking, set in a community where the legal Principal Skinner is a man who assumed that identity under false pretenses. What this does to the continuity of Skinner-related storylines from before the Tamzarian reveal is genuinely complicated. Are those storylines now the history of Tamzarian as Skinner, or of the real Skinner? Do they remain canonical? The show does not answer this. It cannot answer this, because answering it would require committing to one of two unsatisfying options: either acknowledging the Tamzarian reveal as a genuine part of Skinner's history, which the show does not want to do, or treating those earlier episodes as the history of the real Skinner who has since been expelled, which would remove them from the show's current continuity. Instead, the show proceeds as though none of it happened, which is the Springfield way. The Tamzarian episode is the most extreme example of timeline-erasing continuity error in the show's history, but it is not unique in kind. There are other episodes that introduce revelations about characters that significantly rewrite what we knew about them, and that are subsequently handled by the show in ways that partially or fully walk back those revelations. The handling is not always as explicit as the Springfield vote in the Tamzarian episode. Sometimes it simply happens quietly over the course of subsequent episodes, but the pattern is recognizable. Character history in The Simpsons is not fixed. It is written and rewritten in the way that community memory is written and rewritten by the dominant narrative at any given moment, by what the community needs to believe about itself, by the stories that are most useful rather than the stories that are most accurate. Beyond clothing, the show has a rich catalog of prop continuity errors, instances where a specific object that a character is using or holding changes between shots in ways that have no narrative explanation. Homer's car is one of the most extensively documented prop continuity subjects in the show. The specific make, model, and condition of Homer's car, a 1974 pink sedan, is one of his most established possessions. But the car's specific condition varies between episodes in ways that are not always consistent with whatever happened to it in the previous episode. There are episodes where Homer's car sustains significant damage, a dented fender, a broken windshield, a missing bumper, and subsequent episodes where the car appears to be in its standard pre-damage condition, with no indication that repairs were made. There are episodes where a specific feature of the car, a crack in the windshield, a specific scrape on the door is present, and episodes from a comparable narrative period where that feature is absent. The color of Homer's car has its own inconsistency history. The car is pink, but the specific shade of pink varies between episodes, from a warm, salmon-adjacent pink to a cooler, more fuchsia-adjacent pink, in ways that follow the same pattern as the family's clothing colors, stable enough to be recognizable as the same color, variable enough to be documentable as inconsistent. Homer's car also has one of the most specific and most memorable single-episode prop errors in the show's history, an episode where the car is shown from the outside with 4 doors, and then from the inside with a spatial configuration suggesting only 2 doors. This is not a dramatic error. The inside and outside of the car are not shown simultaneously, so the contradiction is not immediately obvious, but it has been documented and is a clean example of the kind of prop inconsistency that arises when different production elements are not fully coordinated. Bart's skateboard is another well-documented prop. The skateboard is one of Bart's defining possessions, as much a part of his visual identity as his slingshot. But the specific design and condition of the skateboard varies between episodes. The deck design, the graphic visible on the bottom of the board, is not consistent. The trucks and wheels vary. The general condition of the board, from pristine to worn, changes in ways that do not track any consistent use and wear narrative. These skateboard variations are partly the result of the same inconsistent reference problem that produces clothing errors. Different animators working from different reference sheets, or from reference sheets that did not specify the skateboard's design in sufficient detail. But they are also partly a reflection of the show's limited investment in the specific details of props that are not narratively central. The skateboard is Bart's skateboard. It is a specific object that belongs to a specific character and helps define that character. But its specific design details are not what the show is communicating through the skateboard. The communication is about Bart, not about the board itself. This is a general principle that underlies much of the show's prop management. Props exist to serve characterization and story, not to be consistent objects in their own right. The specific design of a character's prop matters less than what the prop communicates about who the character is. When the design of the prop is irrelevant to that communication, it is free to vary, and it does. The food that characters eat is one of the most gently inconsistent prop categories in the show. Food items that are central to specific episodes are typically well realized and consistently depicted within those episodes. But food items that appear in background or incidental contexts, the content of Homer's plate at a meal that is not the focus of the scene, the specific item being eaten by a background character, the arrangement of food on a table in a scene that is really about a conversation rather than about the food, are often inconsistent in their depiction. This is not surprising. Animating food in detail is time-consuming, and food that is not central to the scene can reasonably be given less attention. But it does mean that the background dining experiences of the Simpson family, viewed across many episodes, have a slightly variable quality. The same meal depicted differently in different background shots, or a meal that changes composition between shots without anyone serving additional courses. The pattern of post-death character reappearance in The Simpsons is more systematic than individual examples might suggest. When you look at the full record, all the characters who died in the show's regular continuity and subsequently appeared in crowd scenes or background positions, a clear production-level explanation emerges, and it is one that tells us something interesting about how the show's character library was managed. The characters who return most often are the ones whose designs were used most frequently as background models before their deaths. Maud Flanders, before her death, was a regular background presence in Springfield crowd scenes. Her character model, the specific design of her face, her hair, her characteristic clothing was in regular rotation in the background of town meetings, church scenes, school events, and other community gatherings. When that model was needed to populate a crowd after her death, it was still available in the library, and the people responsible for selecting and placing background character models for any given scene might not have had a flag or a note indicating that this specific model represented a dead character. This is not a failure of care. It is a failure of documentation, which is a much more forgiving kind of failure. The production team that worked on the episode in which Maud died knew she was dead. The writers knew. The director knew. The voice actors knew. But the information that this character model was now retired, that it should not be placed in crowd scenes representing the present day of the show's narrative, had to make its way into the documentation system used by the animation team, and in at least some cases, that information did not make the journey successfully. The deaths that result in the cleanest post-death model management are the deaths of characters who were not regularly used as background models, characters whose presence in crowd scenes was unusual rather than routine. These characters, because their models were not in regular background rotation, were less likely to be selected for background use after their deaths. The absence of the habit protected them from the error. The most poignant version of this phenomenon is the case of voice actors whose characters the show chose to retire rather than recast after the actor's death. These characters were not killed within the show's narrative. They were simply absent. And the specific challenge of managing their absence is different from the challenge of managing a character's in-narrative death. Rather than a simple note that the character is dead, the documentation needed is more nuanced, that this character exists in the show's history, may appear in flashback contexts, but should not appear in contemporary scenes because the creative decision has been made not to bring them back. Managing this kind of nuanced documentation across a production team of hundreds of people, across many years of subsequent episodes, is genuinely difficult. It requires more than a note. It requires a culture of institutional memory, a shared understanding of what the show has committed to and why. And while the production team has clearly worked to maintain that institutional memory, the characters have been largely absent from contemporary scenes. As intended, the occasional background appearance suggests that the documentation and the culture are not perfectly integrated across every element of the production. The errors in post-death character management are, in this sense, evidence of something rather beautiful. The show was made by a large enough team, over a long enough period, that its institutional knowledge could not be perfectly transmitted. The errors are the gaps in the relay, the moments where a piece of information failed to reach the person who needed it. They are the cost of scale. There is a specific subcategory of dialogue continuity error that is worth examining in its own right. The category of things that characters should remember and do not. The Simpsons family has experienced a remarkable range of extraordinary events across 36 seasons. Homer has met the president. He has been to space. He has discovered that a crayon was lodged in his brain for most of his life. He has learned the truth about his mother. He has encountered aliens, ghosts, and the divine. He has held hundreds of jobs, visited dozens of countries, and experienced things that would fundamentally reshape any real person's understanding of themselves and the world. And yet Homer, in any given episode, is essentially the same Homer he was in the first season. He has not integrated the experience of going to space into his sense of himself. He has not carried forward the emotional weight of learning about his mother. He has not become, through the accumulation of extraordinary experience, a person who has been shaped by extraordinary experience. He is Homer. He will always be Homer. This is, again, partly the floating timeline convention at work. The show's episodic structure means that each episode can be roughly self-contained, and the characters are reset between episodes to something close to their default state. The emotional journey of any given episode, the learning, the growth, the change, does not persist into subsequent episodes in a way that would require the subsequent episodes to account for it. But within the dialogues of individual episodes, there are specific moments where a character's failure to remember something creates a genuine, documentable continuity error rather than just a general sense of conveniently selective memory. The most specific example involves information about other characters that a given character should logically have retained. Marge has demonstrated, in multiple episodes, specific knowledge of Ned Flanders' history, his psychological background, specific facts about his childhood and his marriage, events that happened between the Flanders and Simpson families in previous episodes. In other episodes, Marge appears unaware of information about Ned that she should logically know given what she has been shown to know in previous episodes. This kind of knowledge inconsistency is the most human feeling of all the show's continuity errors, because it mirrors the way that real memory works selectively, imperfectly, shaped by what is useful in the current moment rather than by any consistent principle of what should be retained. The difference is that in real life, we understand that memory is selective and we grant the person the benefit of the doubt. In fiction, we expect a character's memory to be consistent because it is written rather than lived. The show's characters remember what the current episode needs them to remember. This is a production truth, not a character truth. But the gap between production truth and character truth is where continuity errors live, and the who knows what errors are among the most frequent and the most gently charming in the show's entire catalog. Homer's professional history is so extensive that fans have attempted to compile complete lists of every job he has held across the show's run. The most comprehensive of these lists run to well over 100 distinct occupations, spanning nearly every conceivable field of human endeavor. What is interesting about this list, from an error cataloging perspective, is not just the volume but the specific distribution of errors it produces. Certain categories of job produce more continuity errors than others, and the distribution of errors is itself revealing about how the show used Homer's temporary careers. Jobs that Homer holds for a single episode and then never returns to produce the cleanest situations. The episode is self-contained, the career is clearly temporary, and the subsequent absence of the career in future episodes is expected and unremarkable. These are the least error-productive category of Homer job. Jobs that Homer holds for multiple episodes, or that are referenced in subsequent episodes as something he used to do, produce more opportunities for error, because each subsequent reference is an opportunity to get a detail wrong, to misremember when or how the job ended, to treat a skill Homer demonstrated in that job as either present or absent in inconsistent ways. And jobs that Homer holds in one episode but whose skills or consequences would logically affect many subsequent situations, the jobs whose continuation would, in the real world, permanently alter what Homer can do, are the most error-productive, because they are the jobs where the contrast between what the episode established and what subsequent episodes treat as true is most visible. The space travel job is the canonical example. Homer went to space. This is a specific, significant fact about his life. In subsequent episodes where space or NASA is relevant, Homer's status as someone who went to space should be a factor. Sometimes it is. Sometimes it is not. The inconsistency is not dramatic in any individual episode, but across many episodes it adds up to a Homer whose relationship to his own extraordinary history is genuinely incoherent. The boxing career is another example. Homer became a successful boxer in the episode The Homer They Fall. The episode is clear that he has genuine ability in this area, ability that, within the logic of the episode, is attributed to a specific physical characteristic that would not disappear between episodes. In subsequent episodes where physical confrontations occur, or where boxing or fighting is relevant, Homer's established ability is not consistently reflected. The inventor career is similarly inconsistent. Homer has demonstrated, across multiple episodes, a capacity for invention that is presented as genuine rather than lucky. The inventions work. The underlying creative thinking that produces them is real. But this demonstrated inventiveness does not consistently appear in subsequent episodes where the same kind of thinking would be useful. These are not the most dramatic errors in the show's catalog. They are gentle, episodic, the kind of thing that only registers as error rather than simple convention. If you are thinking about the characters as people who should have consistent histories rather than as comedic constructs shaped by each episode's needs. But they are honest errors. They are what you get when you give a character 100 different jobs and try to keep track of what all of them mean for who that character is. Eventually, something slips. Something is remembered differently than it happened. Something is treated as though it never occurred. Homer has done everything. Homer has always been who he was. Both of these things are true in different moments, and neither of them is quite wrong. The celebrity ecosystem of The Simpsons is worth examining not just for its continuity errors, but for what it reveals about how the show thinks about its own relationship to reality. The Simpsons occupies a specific and unusual position in the spectrum of television realism. It is clearly a fictional world. Springfield does not exist. The characters are not real people. The events depicted are not real events. But the show also incorporates real people and real events into its world on a regular basis. Real celebrities interact with fictional characters. Real historical events are referenced and sometimes depicted. Real cultural products, real books, real movies, real music exist in Springfield alongside the show's fictional versions of these things. This semi-permeable membrane between the show's fictional world and the real world creates a specific set of continuity challenges. When a real celebrity appears in Springfield, they bring their real-world context with them, their actual career status, their actual public persona, their actual relationship to the elements of the real world that the show is using to situate them. And that real-world context changes over time in ways that the show cannot control and that create retroactive continuity complications. A celebrity who appeared in a mid-90s episode as a successful musician is, at the time of that episode, a real person who is currently a successful musician. The episode is a snapshot of that person at that moment in their career, but the episode exists in the show's permanent record as part of its canonical history. And if that musician subsequently becomes more famous, or less famous, or goes through public personal changes, or dies, the episode's depiction of them sits in a complicated relationship to the current reality of who they are. The most extreme version of this is the death of a celebrity who appeared as themselves in The Simpsons. The show's canonical history includes that person appearing in Springfield. The real world now contains the knowledge that they are gone. The episode has not changed, but its meaning has. A cameo that was simply fun when it aired becomes something different, more poignant, or more complicated, or simply more freighted with the awareness of time after the celebrity depicted in it has died. The show cannot retroactively address these changes. It can only continue forward, occasionally acknowledging in later episodes that something has changed in the real world, and carrying its historical record of celebrity appearances as the snapshot archive that it is. The continuity errors this creates are not, strictly speaking, errors in the traditional sense. They are the natural result of a show committing to using real people in its fictional world, and then discovering that real people change in ways that fictional characters do not. They are the cost of the show's specific kind of cultural ambition, its desire to be part of the real world while also being a fiction within it. The Treehouse of Horror episodes have done something interesting to The Simpsons over the course of 33 entries. They have gradually changed what kind of darkness the regular show is allowed to approach. This is a subtle effect, and it is not often discussed in the context of the show's continuity. But it is real, and it has produced some of the show's most interesting boundary cases. Episodes that are clearly regular continuity stories, but that explore territory that would have been strictly Treehouse of Horror territory. In the show's earlier seasons, the escalation of the regular show's darkness in certain episodes, its willingness to approach genuinely difficult subjects, its occasional depictions of genuine loss and consequence, its exploration of the characters' psychological depths in ways that go beyond what a standard sitcom would attempt, is partly the result of the writers and creative team growing more ambitious over time. But it is also partly the result of the Treehouse episodes having expanded the available territory. The Halloween specials demonstrated that Springfield's world could contain real darkness. The regular show learned from that demonstration. This learning process creates continuity questions when a regular episode approaches territory that had previously been strictly Treehouse territory. An episode that deals with mortality, or with genuine psychological breakdown, or with the systematic destruction of a character's history, occupies a space between the regular show's conventions and the Treehouse's conventions. It is canonical, it counts as part of the show's established history, but it has a character that previous canonical episodes did not have. The question of which episodes belong to the regular show, in the sense of fitting its tonal expectations, and which belong to a harder-to-categorize middle space, is one that fans have debated and that has no clear answer. But the existence of that middle space, that territory between the comfortable familiarity of regular Springfield and the explicit non-canonicity of the Treehouse, is itself a product of the Treehouse episode's influence on the show's sense of what it can do. Springfield's geography serves a function beyond simple plot convenience. It serves an emotional function, the function of being universally familiar, of resonating with viewers regardless of where they actually live. This universality is achieved precisely through inconsistency. A Springfield that was located in a specific state, in a specific region, with a specific climate and a specific relationship to specific real geographic features, would be a Springfield that felt specifically like that place. Viewers from other regions would experience it as foreign interesting, perhaps, but not their Springfield. By refusing to commit to any specific geography, by allowing Springfield to be northern when northern seems right and southern when southern seems right, by giving it mountains and oceans and plains as the story requires, the show created a Springfield that belongs to everyone. Every viewer can find their own region's character in it somewhere. Every viewer can feel, at some level, that Springfield is their kind of place. The geographical errors, viewed in this light, are not failures of consistency. They are the mechanism by which the universality is achieved. A Springfield that was geographically consistent would be a Springfield that belonged to one region. The inconsistent Springfield belongs to everyone. This is a more philosophically satisfying account of Springfield's geography than the simple production error explanation, and it is not incompatible with it. The geographical inconsistencies may have begun as simple production issues, different writers and directors having different intuitions about what kind of place Springfield was, but they were retained, and perhaps ultimately embraced, because they serve the show's broader purpose of being a place where everyone belongs. The documented geographical errors, then, are the traces of a creative accident that became a deliberate strategy. The show started with a geographic inconsistency that it could not resolve, and discovered over time that the inconsistency was more valuable than any resolution would have been. Springfield is everywhere. That is the error. That is the point. Before we close, let us spend a little time with the errors that do not fit neatly into any of our previous categories, the ones that are too idiosyncratic, too specific, or too strange to belong to a general classification, but that are worth noting before we are done. There is the episode in which the Simpson family's cat Snowball changes between episodes. The Simpsons have had multiple cats named Snowball, a fact the show has explicitly addressed in one memorable episode, but across the show's run, the specific cat present in the household at any given time is not always clearly established. Background shots occasionally show a cat whose characteristics are inconsistent with whichever Snowball is meant to be the current resident of the Simpson household. This is a gentle, low-stakes error, but it is documented, and it adds a small layer of feline mystery to an already complicated household. There is the matter of Ned Flanders' left-handedness. Ned is established in a memorable early episode as left-handed. This is, in fact, the premise of one of the show's most beloved stories, in which Homer opens a left-handed store for Ned, and the business collapses for reasons that have nothing to do with Ned's handedness. But in subsequent episodes, Ned is occasionally depicted using his right hand for tasks that his established left-handedness would suggest he should perform with his left. This is not a consistent error. Ned's left-handedness is respected in most episodes, but there are documentable instances where it is not observed. There is the matter of the show's title cards. The title cards that introduce each episode of The Simpsons are simple text graphics, and in most cases they are error-free. But there are a small number of episodes where the title card contains a typo or a spacing error, a letter missing, a word slightly misaligned that made it to broadcast without correction. These are among the most visible errors in the show's catalog, appearing in the first seconds of the episode, and yet they are also among the least noticed, because the title card appears so briefly and is processed so automatically that most viewers absorb it without scrutinizing it for errors. There is the matter of episode numbers and production codes, which occasionally appear within the show itself as in-joke references. These references are sometimes accurate, they reflect the correct production code for the episode in question, and sometimes inaccurate, either using a code from a different episode or using a code format that is inconsistent with the show's actual production numbering system. This is a particularly arcane category of error, one that would only be caught by viewers who know the show's production history in some detail, but it has been documented. There is the matter of background music that is incorrect for the depicted setting. In a small number of episodes, music that is playing within the world of the story, not the underscore, but a piece of music that a character is listening to, or that is playing in a location the characters are visiting, does not match what would logically be playing in that context. A character is at a party where a specific song is playing, and the song that is audible in one shot is different from the song audible in the next shot of the same party. A radio that is playing in one scene is producing music that was established to be a different genre in the same scene's setup. There is the matter of Homer's injury history and what it implies about his medical records. Homer has been treated at Springfield General Hospital numerous times across the show's run for injuries and conditions that range from routine to catastrophic. The medical records that Springfield General would logically maintain for a patient who has visited as frequently as Homer has should be substantial. And yet in episodes where Homer's medical history is relevant, the history that is referenced is not always consistent with the accumulated record of his previous treatments. Conditions that were previously diagnosed and treated are occasionally re-diagnosed as new discoveries. Procedures that were apparently performed are occasionally described as untried options. These medical continuity errors are a subset of the larger character history error problem, but they are worth noting specifically because the medical context gives them a slightly different character. In most areas of character history, the floating timeline provides an explanation for inconsistency the past has shifted to accommodate the present. But medical history, in theory, should be more resistant to this kind of revision, because medical records are documents rather than memories, and documents do not typically revise themselves. The implication, which the show does not invite you to draw, but which is available if you are paying attention, is that Springfield's medical establishment has its own relationship with the show's flexible continuity, managing its documentation in a way that makes it as malleable as everything else in this impossible town. And this, in the end, is the consistent feature of every category of Simpsons error we have examined tonight: the consistency of inconsistency. The show has produced errors in every dimension we have examined: visual, spatial, temporal, narrative, professional, medical, and in every case, the errors follow the same underlying logic. The current moment, the current story, the current need takes precedence over the accumulated record of previous moments and previous needs. This is not a flaw in The Simpsons, it is the condition of its existence. A show that ran for 5 seasons could maintain perfect consistency. A show that ran for 15 could maintain good consistency with some careful effort. A show that has run for 36 seasons and shows no signs of stopping has placed itself beyond the reach of any consistency standard that a finite team of humans could maintain. The errors are what remains when you subtract the impossible from the attempted, and what remains in this case is still remarkable. There is a category of Simpsons error that almost nobody talks about, and that is audio continuity. Most discussions of the show's mistakes focus on what can be seen: the wrong shirt color, the missing wedding ring, the door that opens the wrong way, but the show has a parallel record of audio inconsistencies that are just as charming, just as revealing of the production process, and just as easy to overlook if you are watching rather than listening. The most common audio continuity error in The Simpsons is the misplaced ambient sound. Every scene in the show is built from multiple audio layers: the dialogue recorded by the voice actors, a musical underscore composed to fit the scene's emotional tone, and a layer of ambient sound that is meant to represent the acoustic character of the location. A scene set in the Simpson kitchen should sound like a kitchen: the low hum of the refrigerator, the occasional creak of a cabinet, the ambient noise of a domestic interior. A scene set on a Springfield street should sound like a street traffic in the distance, the occasional sound of a passing car, the acoustic openness of an outdoor environment. These ambient layers are applied during a MISC production sound mixing process, and they are applied by people who are working from the visual material of the episode. In most cases, they get it right, but in a small number of episodes, there are shots where the ambient sound layer applied to the scene does not match the visual environment of the scene. An interior scene that sounds faintly like it is outdoors. An outdoor scene where the acoustic character suggests a smaller, more enclosed space. A scene set in a crowd that sounds quieter than the visual number of people present would justify. These are subtle errors. They are the kind of thing that you might not consciously register, but that produces a vague sense of something being slightly off, the feeling that the scene does not quite sit right, without being able to articulate why. They are errors that only become visible when you describe them, and that become invisible again the moment you stop paying attention to the audio layer and simply watch the show. The voice acting audio continuity errors are more specific and more documentable. These are the instances where the line of dialogue that a character speaks does not quite match the lip animation visible on screen, where the mouth movements are slightly out of sync with the words, or where the animation was produced to match a slightly different version of the line than the one that ended up in the final audio track. Lip sync errors in animated television are extremely common and are generally considered an acceptable production artifact rather than a meaningful error. The process of matching animation to dialogue is genuinely difficult. It requires either recording the dialogue first and animating to it, which is the standard approach in American animation and which The Simpsons uses, or animating first and recording to the animation, which is more common in some other animation traditions. Even with dialogue-first animation, small sync errors occur because the animation is produced at a different time and sometimes by a different team than the dialogue recording. What is specific to The Simpsons and what creates some of its most interesting audio continuity situations is the show's practice of recording multiple versions of certain lines or of changing lines after the animation has already been produced. The show's writers have revised scripts during production, occasionally changing a line after the character's mouth movements have already been animated to a different version of that line. The result is a scene where the audio and the animation are telling slightly different stories, where the character's mouth is doing the movements for one set of words, while their voice is saying a different set of words. These instances are more common in the show's later seasons, when the digital production process made audio editing and re-recording easier relative to the animation. They reflect a willingness on the part of the production team to prioritize the quality of the dialogue over the perfect synchronization of the audio and visual tracks, a reasonable creative priority, but one that produces a specific category of visible error. The music continuity errors are perhaps the most subjective category. The show's musical underscore, composed by Alf Clausen for many seasons and subsequently by other composers, is one of its least appreciated elements present in almost every scene, shaping the emotional texture of the show's world, and generally very well matched to the visual and narrative content of each scene. But in a small number of episodes, the musical choices are documentably inconsistent with the scene's content. A tender musical moment scored with something slightly too bright, a comedic beat underscored with something slightly too solemn. A transition that produces a jarring contrast between the music of one scene and the music of the next. Most of these are judgment calls rather than clear errors. Musical interpretation is inherently subjective, and what sounds like a mismatch to one listener might sound like a deliberate tonal choice to another. But there are a few instances where the musical error is specific enough to document. A scene where the music playing is identifiably the theme from a different type of scene, or a moment where a musical cue begins at the wrong point in the scene, producing an effect that is clearly unintentional rather than a deliberate creative choice. All of these audio errors share a quality with the visual errors we have spent most of this script discussing. They are evidence of a production process operating at enormous scale, under significant time pressure, producing more content than any comparable team in the history of American television. The errors are not failures of intelligence or care. They are the signatures of a human enterprise large, ambitious, imperfect, and remarkable. The end credits of The Simpsons are one of the show's most consistently overlooked elements, and they contain their own small population of errors that are worth noting before we are entirely done. The credits list the names of the people responsible for each element of the episode's production: the writers, directors, animators, composers, voice actors, editors, and the many other contributors whose work goes into making 30 minutes of animated television. In most cases, the credits are accurate. The name listed is the person who did the work, and the role listed is the role they performed. But in a small number of episodes, the credits contain errors. A name is misspelled, sometimes subtly, a single letter wrong, the kind of error that is easy to miss in proofreading because the name looks almost right, and the eye fills in the missing or incorrect letter automatically. A role is misattributed, someone listed as performing a function that was actually performed by a different person, or listed under a slightly different title than the one that correctly describes what they did. These credit errors are, in a sense, the most purely human errors in the show's catalog. They are not production pipeline problems or continuity management challenges. They are typos. They are the kind of mistake that happens when a document is prepared under time pressure by a person who is tired and who has been looking at the same text for too long. They are the kind of mistake that most people make regularly, in contexts far less high stakes than a network television broadcast. The fact that they appear in The Simpsons credits is, in its small way, humanizing. Behind the enormous, sprawling production apparatus that makes the show is a person who, at some late point in the production process, was typing names into a credits document and made a small, understandable mistake. And that mistake went to broadcast and was preserved in the show's archive and is now part of the permanent record of a cultural institution. There is something quietly lovely about that. The credit errors are the show admitting, in the most literal way possible, that it was made by people. Imperfect, tired, human people doing an enormous amount of work, caring deeply about the result, and occasionally mistyping a name. All of the errors in this script are, ultimately, that kind of admission. The wrong shirt color, the missing wedding ring, the reappearing dead character, the house with an impossible floor plan, they are all evidence of the same basic truth. The Simpsons was made by people, an extraordinary number of people, producing an extraordinary amount of work with an extraordinary amount of skill and care and creativity. And, like everything made by people, it contains traces of the people who made it, their attention, their ambition, their fatigue, and their humanity. The errors are the fingerprints of the makers, and after 36 seasons and nearly 800 episodes, there are a great many fingerprints to find. One of the more interesting features of The Simpsons' relationship with its own continuity errors is the degree to which the show has, at various points, acknowledged those errors not through formal corrections or apologies, but through jokes, winks, and deliberate references that signal to attentive viewers that the writers know the errors are there. The show's use of meta-humor to address its own continuity issues began early and has continued throughout its run. One of the most famous examples is the recurring joke in which a character says something that is flatly inconsistent with established fact, and another character responds with a knowing look at the camera or a line that acknowledges the impossibility of what was just said. These moments are not corrections. They are acknowledgments, the show signaling that it knows what it is doing, that the error is known to the writers, and that the writers have chosen to proceed despite the error rather than resolve it. The couch gag itself is, in one reading, the most elaborate and sustained acknowledgement of continuity error in the show's history. The couch gag presents the Simpson family arriving home and sitting on the couch, always the same action, never the same result. The family might arrive to find the couch occupied by strangers, or find themselves duplicated, or find the couch in a completely different setting. The joke has been running for 36 years and has never produced the same gag twice. It is a weekly reminder that in Springfield, nothing is guaranteed to be the same as it was last time. The universe of the show is not stable. It is not consistent. It can produce anything. Viewed through this lens, the couch gag is not just a cold open gimmick. It is the show's opening statement about its own nature, that Springfield is a place where the rules of continuity do not apply in the way they apply everywhere else, and that the audience should settle in to enjoy the instability rather than resist it. The Treehouse of Horror episodes have also been used, occasionally, to address specific continuity problems by exaggerating them to the point of absurdity. An episode that parodies the show's habit of killing and reviving characters, or that explicitly depicts the floating timeline as a supernatural phenomenon, is engaging with the error record in a way that transcends simple acknowledgement. It is processing the errors through the show's comedic sensibility, converting them from problems into material. The writers' commentaries on the DVD releases of early seasons contain numerous moments where the writers discuss specific errors with a combination of rueful acknowledgement and cheerful indifference. They know about the errors, they noticed them, and then they moved on, because the show needed to move on, because the production schedule demanded it, because the pursuit of perfection was never the goal. What the goal was, what it has always been, is the thing that every episode of The Simpsons has delivered at its best: a half hour in Springfield, in the company of people who feel like family even though they are yellow and four-fingered and live in a house with a floor plan that makes no architectural sense, in a town that cannot be found on any map but that feels like the place where you grew up, wherever you grew up. The errors are there, they always will be, and for 36 seasons, they have not mattered at all. Let us spend some time with specific documented errors that span the show's entire run, not organized by category, but simply presented as a catalog, a list of the specific moments where the show's reality flickered and something that was not quite right appeared on screen. In the Season 1 episode Bart the General, the stripes on the shirt worn by a background character at the school change direction between two consecutive shots. The shirt is striped. The stripes are horizontal in one shot and diagonal in the next. The character is not moving. The shirt is not wet. There is no narrative explanation. The stripes simply changed. In the Season 2 episode Bart Gets an F, Homer is shown wearing his work uniform at the breakfast table in one shot and then wearing civilian clothes in the next shot without leaving the table or the scene. The transition is instantaneous and unexplained. One moment he is dressed for work, The next moment he is dressed for a Saturday. The scene continues as though nothing changed. In the Season 3 episode Homer Defined, the clock on the wall of the nuclear power plant control room reads 2:15 in one shot and 3:40 in the next shot, despite only a few seconds of narrative time having elapsed between the shots. The clock is not a plot point, it is background. It simply tells a different time in every shot it appears in during this episode. In the Season 4 episode Lisa the Beauty Queen, Lisa's ribbon, the ribbon she wins in the beauty pageant, changes color between the scene where she receives it and the scene immediately following, where she is shown with it at home. The ribbon is blue in the first scene, it is red in the second. No exchange has taken place. The ribbon has simply changed color between scenes. In the Season 5 episode Cape Fear, Sideshow Bob's tattoo changes between shots during the scene where he is being released from prison. The tattoo is one of the episode's most memorable visual gags, and the specific content of the tattoo is central to the joke. But between two shots in the release scene, the tattoo's design is slightly different, not dramatically different, not differently enough to ruin the joke, but documentably changed in its specific details. In the Season 6 episode Bart's Girlfriend, the book that Jessica Lovejoy is holding when she first appears in the school library changes between the shot where she picks it up and the shot where she is shown reading it. The cover design is different. The thickness of the book is different. In the space between two cuts, the book became a different book. In the Season 7 episode King Size Homer, Homer's coffee mug, which he uses in several scenes during his work-from-home sequence, changes its design repeatedly throughout the episode. The mug has a pattern on it in some shots. In others, the same mug appears to be plain white. In still others, the pattern is present but oriented differently. The mug is used in every scene but is never the same mug twice. In the Season 8 episode You Only Move Twice, the layout of the Globex Corporation facility changes between Homer's first tour of the building and subsequent scenes set in the same building. Corridors that led in one direction in the tour sequence lead in different directions in later scenes. Rooms that were adjacent in the tour are separated by additional rooms in later scenes. The building has reorganized itself between visits. In the Season 9 episode Lisa's Sax, which depicts the acquisition of Lisa's saxophone through a flashback to 1974, several details of the flashback setting are inconsistent with other flashback episodes that depict the same general time period. Specifically, the specific age that Homer and Marge appear to be in this flashback is inconsistent with the ages they appear to be in other flashbacks set in comparable time periods. They are older in some flashbacks than the narrative would require, and younger in others. In the Season 10 episode, Viva Ned Flanders, the chips that Homer and Ned use at the casino table change denomination between shots without any chips being exchanged. In one shot, the chips are of one color, representing one value. In the next shot, the chips are of a different color, representing a different value. The characters do not exchange chips between shots. The chips have simply become different chips. In the Season 11 episode Behind the Laughter, which presents The Simpsons as a real family who stars in a television show about themselves, several of the biographical details presented in the episode are inconsistent with details established in previous episodes. This is partly intentional. The episode is a mockumentary, and its humor partly derives from the gap between the official version of events and the events as they were depicted in the actual show. But some of the inconsistencies appear to be unintentional rather than deliberate, details that are simply wrong rather than deliberately reframed. In the Season 12 episode Homer, in which Homer has the crayon removed from his brain and temporarily becomes a genius, the position of the crayon, the specific nasal passage it is lodged in, the specific depth at which it sits appears slightly different in the removal scene than in the earlier diagnostic scene. The crayon is the same crayon. It is in roughly the same location, but the precise geometry of its lodging has shifted between the two depictions. In the Season 13 episode, The Bart Wants What It Wants, Rainer Wolfcastle's daughter Greta is depicted as attending Springfield Elementary School. In subsequent episodes set at Springfield Elementary, Greta is not among the background students, and her enrollment at the school is not referenced. She has left as silently as she arrived, without graduation, expulsion, or transfer being depicted. In the Season 14 episode Break My Wife, Please, Homer walks to work as a lifestyle experiment. The route he takes through Springfield is documented in some detail during the episode. The route is not consistent with the spatial relationships between the Simpson house and the nuclear power plant established in other episodes. The distances are wrong. The landmarks are in wrong positions relative to each other. The specific geography of the walk does not match the established geography of Springfield. In the season 15 episode, My Mother the Carjacker, Mona Simpson appears in an episode that takes place several seasons after her canonical death in a later episode. But Mona's death, as depicted in that later episode, is presented as though it is a first encounter with mortality for the character, as though she has not previously departed from the show's narrative. The specific timing of her exits and entries into the show's canonical timeline is complicated enough that the error record for Mona-related episodes is itself a subject of some fan scholarship. In the season 16 episode, There's Something About Marrying, Springfield legalizes same-sex marriage. This is a canonical event in the show's world it was depicted. It happened. It has implications for the legal structure of Springfield's society. In subsequent episodes, this legal change is not referenced, and the social context of Springfield appears to be the same as it was before the legalization. The law exists in canon. Its effects do not. In the season 17 episode, The Seemingly Never-Ending Story, the episode is structured as a series of nested stories, within stories, each told by a different character. The show is careful, within the episode itself, to maintain the correct narrative level as it moves between stories. But in one transition between narrative levels, a detail that was established at one level of the story appears at a different level without having been transmitted between the levels. A fact that character A knows, in the story told by character A, appears in the story being told about character A by character B, without character B having been established as knowing that fact. In the season 18 episode Crook and Ladder, Homer becomes a volunteer firefighter. The specific truck that the volunteer fire department uses in this episode is inconsistent in its design between the exterior shots, where it appears one way, and the interior shots, where the space inside the truck is larger than the exterior shots would allow. In the season 19 episode E Pluribus Vigum, Springfield holds a presidential primary. The specific sequence of events in the primary, the polling, the campaigning, the voting, is depicted with a general accuracy to how American political primaries work. But the specific date of the primary, as established within the episode, is inconsistent with the dates of real-world primaries in the years surrounding the episode's broadcast. The fictional primary exists in a slightly different time than the real primaries it is satirizing. In the season 20 episode, Take My Life, Please, Homer discovers what his life might have been like if he had won a high school election. The specific election depicted in the flashback is inconsistent with the depiction of Homer's high school years in other flashback episodes, not dramatically, but in the specific visual character of the high school, the specific composition of the student body that is visible in the background, and the specific year in which the episode's flashback is set relative to Homer's established birth year. In the season 21 episode The Bob Next Door, a character's mouth is transplanted onto another character's face as part of the episode's central plot. The transplant is the episode's premise and is well realized within the episode. But the specific medical details of the transplant, which mouth came from which character, and the resulting visual appearance of both characters are inconsistent between the scene where the transplant is revealed and the subsequent scenes in which the transplanted characters interact with other people. The specifics of who has which mouth shift slightly between the revelation and the resolution. In the season 22 episode Donnie Fatso, a character who was established to be dead in a previous season appears in a scene that is clearly set in the present day of the show's narrative, without any explanation for their return. This is not a flashback. This is not a dream sequence. This is a scene in Springfield, set now, containing a character who cannot be there. The character appears, delivers their lines, and the episode continues. These are a small selection of the documented errors across the show's run. They span every season. They cover every category of error we have discussed. And they share exactly one feature. They are all, despite everything, part of The Simpsons. They are part of what makes the show what it is: the enormous, improbable, imperfect, endlessly fascinating document of a fictional world that has been maintained, more or less, by human hands for 36 years. You could find every one of these errors. You could watch for them. You could keep a list. Many people have. And at the end of that list, After all the wrong shirt colors and impossible floor plans and inexplicably returning dead characters, you would still be left with The Simpsons. Still funny, still warm. Still, after all this time, home. It is late now, or early, or somewhere in between whatever hour brought you here to spend time in Springfield with the volume turned down and the lights off, and the long, quiet stretch of night ahead of you. We have covered a lot of ground. We have cataloged the mistakes in the animation, the inconsistencies in the characters' histories, the spatial impossibilities of the town itself, the temporal paradoxes of a floating timeline, the wardrobe failures, the returning dead, the dialogue that contradicts itself, the career histories that do not add up, the celebrity visits that create their own complications, and the specific, strange contamination that the Halloween specials have introduced into the regular show's sense of what it can contain. We have visited Springfield in detail. We have noted every wrong door, and every changed shirt, and every character who should not be alive, and every building that cannot possibly fit where the show says it is. We have looked at the show with the kind of attention that most people reserve for things they love, the kind of attention that finds the imperfections not to criticize but to understand, to know the thing more completely than a casual glance allows. And what we found, after all of that attention, is not a flawed show. We found a show that was made, really made by hundreds of people over decades, working under pressure, caring about the result, producing something that has lasted longer than any comparable achievement in the history of American animation. The mistakes are not the story. They are the evidence that there is a story. Evidence that behind every frame of this show is a person who drew it, who colored it, who recorded the voice for it, who composed the music under it, who typed the words into the script document and then revised them and revised them again. Evidence that what looks, from a comfortable distance like a smooth and seamless world is, up close, a human construction built from effort and attention and care and, occasionally, error. We are gentler with the things we love when we understand how they were made. A song is more beautiful when you know how hard the melody was to find. A painting is more moving when you know how many times the artist put down the brush in doubt. A television show is more precious when you know that 36 seasons of it were produced by people who were tired sometimes and pressed for time, and who looked away for just a moment and missed the thing that ended up in the final cut. The Simpsons is not perfect. It never was. And it is one of the greatest things American popular culture has ever produced. Both of those things are true, and they are not in conflict. Springfield will be here when you wake up. The house on Evergreen Terrace will still be standing, its floor plan as impossible as ever, its living room as warm as always. Bart will still be 10. Lisa will still be 8. Homer will still be coming home from the plant with the same boundless, baffled optimism he has always had. The errors will still be there too, hiding in the backgrounds, waiting in the wardrobe continuity, tucked into the corners of scenes where nobody is looking. But that is for tomorrow. For now, let the voices fade. Let the color of Springfield, that impossible, specific, beloved yellow, soften behind your eyelids. Let the theme music play quietly in whatever part of your mind keeps music. You are in Springfield. You have always been in Springfield. And in Springfield, for whatever reason, radiation, or dreams, or the specific gravity of a show that has been loved this long by this many people, nothing ever really has to end. There is always more. With a show of this size and age, there is always more. So let us add one final layer to everything we have covered, a slower, more contemplative pass through some of the errors and mysteries that did not fit neatly into earlier sections, presented here not as a systematic catalog but as a series of quiet observations, the kind of things you might notice when you have been watching for a very long time. The specific sound of Homer's voice changed across the show's run in ways that are documented but rarely discussed. Dan Castellaneta has voiced Homer for the full 36 seasons, and the character's vocal quality has evolved over that time, slightly higher in pitch in the early seasons, slightly lower and more settled in the middle period, with specific mannerisms and verbal tics becoming more pronounced at different points in the run. These changes are natural and expected from any voice actor across decades of performance. But they occasionally create a subtle discontinuity when very early episodes are played back-to-back with later ones. The Homer of 1990 sounds like a slightly younger, slightly less settled version of the Homer of 2005. This is not an error in any traditional sense. It is simply the passage of time, visible in a medium where time is not supposed to pass. The floating timeline has no mechanism for managing the fact that the voice actors age even when the characters do not, and the result is a very gentle longitudinal inconsistency that spans the entire show. The specific relationship between Chief Wiggum and effective law enforcement has been a running theme of the show's comedy from its earliest seasons. The Springfield Police Department is chronically incompetent, underfunded, corrupt in a petty rather than a genuinely sinister way, and led by a man whose defining characteristic is an almost philosophical indifference to whether crimes get solved. This is funny. It has been funny for 36 years. But across those 36 years, the specific nature of Wiggum's incompetence has shifted in ways that create a soft continuity problem. In early seasons, Wiggum is incompetent but motivated. He tries to do his job and fails. In middle seasons, he is incompetent and occasionally corrupt. He does not always try to do his job, and sometimes actively obstructs justice for petty reasons. In later seasons, he occupies a more complex middle space, capable of genuine competence in specific moments while remaining broadly ineffective as an institutional force. These are reasonable character developments, but they are not developments that the show has explicitly acknowledged, or that exist in a consistent linear progression. The specific version of Wiggum present in any given episode depends more on what that episode needs from him than on any continuous arc of character development. The Springfield Elementary School's specific population of students has fluctuated across the show's run in ways that cannot be entirely explained by the floating timeline. Background students who appeared regularly in early seasons disappear from later seasons without any narrative explanation. New students appear in crowd scenes without any introduction. The specific composition of Bart's class, the children visible in the background of classroom scenes, is not consistent between seasons, and is sometimes not consistent within a single season. Some of this is straightforwardly the result of background character management practices we have already discussed, but some of it represents a more specific challenge. The show has occasionally introduced background students as semi-recurring characters, giving them enough screen time to become recognizable, and then simply stopped using them. These semi-recurring students exist in the show's history. They were there, they were part of the school's world, but they are gone now, without explanation, absorbed back into the general Springfield population. The school bully ecosystem is a particularly interesting example of this. Nelson Muntz is the show's canonical bully, well-established and consistently depicted. But Springfield Elementary has at various points also contained other bullies' background characters whose role was defined by their relationship to bullying and who occupied roughly the same social space as Nelson. These characters appear and disappear without any clear logic. Some of them become more established over time. Others simply stop appearing. The social hierarchy of the school's bully population is not stable across the show's run. The specific dynamics of the Simpson household's relationship with money have been inconsistent across the show's run in ways that create their own quiet continuity problems. In early seasons, the family's financial precarity is a source of genuine tension. Homer's job is important not just for his sense of purpose, but because the family genuinely needs the income. Episodes involving money problems have a weight to them because the financial risk is real within the show's world. In later seasons, the family's financial situation becomes harder to pin down. Homer and Marge have, at various points, had significant financial windfalls. Inheritances, lottery winnings, successful business ventures, legal settlements. They have also suffered significant financial losses. The net effect of these fluctuations should, over time, have established a specific current financial status for the family. But the show does not maintain that status consistently. The family is as financially precarious as any given episode needs them to be, and as financially comfortable as any other episode needs them to be, without a clear through line connecting these varying states. This financial instability is among the most relatable of the show's continuity inconsistencies because it mirrors the way that many families actually experience money in episodes, in crises, in occasional moments of abundance that do not add up to long-term security. The Simpsons' financial life is not a continuous ledger. It is a series of financial experiences, each complete in itself, connected by the family's shared identity rather than by any accountable balance. The specific religious life of the Flanders household and the specific theology practiced by the Flanders family has been depicted in ways that are broadly consistent but specifically variable across the show's run. Ned Flanders is a devout Christian. This is one of his most defining and most consistently maintained characteristics. But the specific denomination he belongs to, the specific doctrinal positions he holds. And the specific practices of his household have varied between episodes in ways that suggest different writers had somewhat different models of what Ned's religion looked like in practice. In some episodes, Ned's religion is recognizably evangelical Protestant, characterized by personal relationship with Jesus, biblical literalism, and an emphasis on individual salvation. In others, it has a more generic American Christian character without clear denominational markers. In others still, it incorporates elements that are more specifically associated with particular Christian traditions. Ned is always devout. He is not always devout in quite the same way. This is not a criticism. Writing a consistently theologically accurate portrait of a specific religious tradition across 36 seasons of comedy by a rotating team of writers who themselves likely have varying degrees of familiarity with that tradition is genuinely difficult. The broad strokes of Ned's faith are maintained. The specific details are allowed to vary in service of each episode's needs. The same variability applies to the show's depiction of Jewish Springfield residents, particularly Krusty the Clown and his father, Rabbi Krustovsky. The specific nature of their practice, how strictly observant they are, what their relationship to specific Jewish legal and cultural traditions is, how their identity as Jewish people shapes their experience of Springfield, has been depicted with a general respect but specific variability that mirrors the Flanders situation. The Simpsons, at its best, treats religious faith as a genuine and important part of its characters' identities, not a punchline, not a character flaw, not a source of ridicule, but a real human experience that shapes how people see the world. It does not always depict the specifics of those faiths with perfect accuracy or consistency, but the underlying respect is consistent even when the details are not. The specific history of Springfield itself when it was founded, by whom, under what circumstances, and what historical events shaped its development is one of the most extensively and deliberately scrambled continuity areas in the show. Springfield's history has been told multiple times, in multiple episodes, and each telling is different. The founding of the town, the identity of its original settlers, the specific historical moments that established its character, these have been depicted in ways that are mutually inconsistent, producing a history that cannot be reconstructed into a single coherent narrative. This scrambling of local history is, we think, partly deliberate and partly the natural result of different writers approaching the same material with different reference points. But it has the effect of making Springfield's past as unstable as Springfield's present, a place where even the deepest roots of the community are subject to revision, where the official history is whatever the current moment needs it to be. And perhaps that is the deepest truth about Springfield's continuity errors, taken as a whole. They do not represent a failure to maintain a consistent world. They represent the accurate depiction of a specific kind of place. A place where the official version of things is always negotiable, where history is what you say it is, where the past rearranges itself to fit the present, and where the community's shared agreement about reality is the only reality that matters. Springfield's errors are Springfield's nature, and Springfield's nature is, in some ways, more honest than any consistent fictional world could be, because the real world is like this too. History is contested, memory is unreliable, official versions are negotiated. The past is not a fixed thing. It is a story that gets told and retold, shaped by the needs of the tellers, serving the purposes of the moment. Springfield just does this more visibly, more yellowly, with more episodes and more wrong shirt colors, and more impossible floor plans, and more characters who are alive when they should be dead. Springfield is the world, seen clearly and without shame. And that, after everything, is why we keep watching. We have arrived, at last, at the end of our time in Springfield. And before we go, let us sit for a moment with what it means to have watched this show for as long as most of us have watched it. If you were 10 years old when The Simpsons premiered in December of 1989, you are 46 years old now. You have spent more than a third of your life in a world where this show exists, where Springfield is a place that can be visited, where Homer and Marge and Bart and Lisa and Maggie are, in whatever limited sense fictional people can be people, familiar. If you were born after the show premiered and a very large number of the show's current viewers were, then you have never lived in a world without The Simpsons. The show predates your conscious memory. It was always there. It will feel, in some experiential sense, as though it always will be. This is a genuinely strange relationship to have with a piece of popular culture. Most television shows arrive, run for a few seasons, and are gone before the viewer has had time to form the kind of relationship with them that we form with things that have been present for decades. The Simpsons has been present for decades. It has been part of the background of American life for long enough that it has become, for many people, genuinely difficult to remember what it would feel like for it not to exist. The continuity errors that we have spent this long evening cataloging are, among other things, evidence of that duration. They accumulate across seasons because there are so many seasons. They span so many categories because the show has had time to make errors in every category. They are so extensively documented by fans because those fans have had 36 years to watch and rewatch and notice and note and compile and share. The errors are evidence of love. 2. The specific kind of love that pays close enough attention to notice the wrong shirt color in a background shot, that remembers the specific shade of yellow that the couch was 3 seasons ago, that knows the floor plan of the Simpson house well enough to be troubled when a room appears that was not there before. You cannot find errors in something you do not care about. The care is the precondition of the noticing. And the errors, when they are found, do not diminish the thing. They deepen it. They make the show more fully known not just as a product, not just as an entertainment, but as a human enterprise with all the beauty and imperfection that phrase implies. Here is the thing about loving something that has been made by human hands. The imperfections are not unfortunate additions to the thing you love. They are part of the thing itself. The worn place on a favorite book. The missed note in a beloved recording. The scene in the film that never quite worked but that you have come to cherish anyway because it is part of the film, because it is part of what the film is, because the film without it would be a different film that you would love differently. The wrong shirt color in the background of a Simpsons episode is part of The Simpsons. The impossible floor plan of the Simpson house is part of The Simpsons. The character who appears alive in the crowd when they should not be there is part of The Simpsons. These are not corruptions of the show. They are the show, the whole show, imperfect and enormous and genuinely remarkable. 36 seasons. Nearly 800 episodes. Millions of frames of animation. Billions of words of dialogue. An incalculable quantity of music. All of it produced by human beings. By people with lives and pressures and good days and bad days. By people who cared about this thing they were making even when the production schedule made caring difficult. By people who were paid to make a cartoon and made instead something that has outlasted most of the other things their generation created. The Simpsons is not perfect. It is better than perfect. It is real, in the way that things that are genuinely loved and genuinely made are real, flawed, and specific and irreplaceable. And now it is time to sleep. The errors will be there when you wake up, still hiding in the backgrounds of episodes you have seen a dozen times, still waiting to be noticed by whoever is paying attention. The show will be there too, all of it. The good seasons and the great seasons, and the seasons that did not quite work but that still belong to the same enormous thing. Springfield will be there, impossible and warm and yellow, still lit by a power plant that should have been shut down decades ago, still populated by people who should have aged but have not, still containing a family that should not work but does. Bart is still 10. Lisa is still 8. Homer is still coming home. And that is enough. That has always been enough. Good night.